Robb Stark stood on the battlements of Riverrun, the autumn sun glazing the red-gold tangles of his hair. The early morning air was sharp with the Riverland's crisp chill, and mist clung to the rolling waters of the Red Fork. In the courtyard below, the clang of steel carried as men honed their blades and tightened shield straps. War had broken out across the Seven Kingdoms, and young Robb, king in the north, had already won a vital victory when he seized Jaime Lannister at the Whispering Wood. Even so, each triumph had its cost. Word of his father's execution in King's Landing still felt like the twist of a knife in his chest, unrelenting. The realm was in chaos, and at the heart of that chaos was one newly emerged truth. Jon Snow was no mere northern bastard, but a Targaryen heir, hidden in Winterfell's halls and now openly challenging the Iron Throne with supporters rallying to his blood right. A swirl of sorrow, rage, and desperation had seized Robb when the letters arrived. He did not want to believe it. Jon Snow, son of his father's sister Lyanna and Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, his own cousin, not truly his half-brother. Yet the news had spread quickly, from lords to small folk, and more disturbing were the rumors that Jon had found allies in the Reach and perhaps even in the Vale. The years of war had fractured alliances across the realm, and those lords left disenchanted with Lannister rule might now gravitate to this new Targaryen banner, especially if it brought the promise of stability or vengeance of their own. Robb's knuckles whitened on the stone merlin as he gazed down at the throng of Northmen and river lords. They were brave men, loyal men, but battered by constant marching and skirmishes. The horrors had begun to weigh on him, nights thick with the memory of men who died in his name. If there was one lesson the war had driven deep into his bones, it was this: do what is necessary or be consumed by the rising storms. The watchers around him saw a young man clad in northern mail, his lord father's great cloak draped across his shoulders, the stark direwolf sigil pinned at the left breast. His face, though still bearing the softness of youth, had grown set with the harsh lines of leadership. Below, a door opened into the courtyard. Jaime Lannister emerged, flanked by a pair of black-bearded Greatjon Umber's men, wearing the loose-fitting garments Robb had allowed him. No armor, no swords, but free of chains. Jaime's bright hair captured the sunlight with near-blinding brilliance. Though under guard, he moved with a certain languid ease that bespoke the arrogance of a man convinced that captivity was only a passing inconvenience. Robb turned to face his mother, Catelyn Stark, who lingered at his side. Lines of exhaustion had etched themselves onto her face, and grief threatened to break through her composure at any moment. But she held herself with quiet dignity, focusing the entirety of her disapproval on Jaime below. "We cannot trust him," she said softly. "You know that. You know what he did to Bran, the attempt at pushing him to his death." Robb shook his head, a reflex. "There is no justice for that, not now, not here. If we keep him caged, we gain nothing but hatred from the Lannisters. If we kill him, we risk Tywin Lannister's wrath tenfold. We must seek an end to this. The North can't fight both the Lannisters and a Targaryen heir uniting half the realm." Catelyn's eyebrows arched. "So you think to free him?" "I do," Robb said. "His father is cunning, wealthy, and wields the might of the Westerlands. If House Stark can parley with him, no matter how unlikely it may seem, I can push for a truce. The realm is bleeding. My father wanted peace, as well as justice, but peace must come before vengeance if we are to survive." Catelyn's lips parted in protest, but she found no immediate answer. Instead, she watched the figure below. Jaime was pacing near a stable post, running a hand through his golden hair. "The Lannisters betrayed us. They killed your father. They tried to kill your brother." Robb's heart panged at the reminder of Ned's fate. But he heard the timbre of his father's voice in memory. "We do what we must for the sake of the realm. Honor tempered by practicality. We have no proof that Jaime pushed Bran, only suspicions. And all of those are overshadowed now by the monstrous act of Joffrey, if indeed Joffrey is a Lannister at all. But that is another matter. We face an even greater storm with this Targaryen threat. From what my scouts say, Jon has taken up the banner of the dragon with the help of Daenerys Targaryen, who has landed in Dorne. They have the support of House Martell, and apparently there are murmurs from the Vale. If Jon calls us to swear fealty, what shall I do? Bend the knee to my father's sister's son because of some hidden blood claim? Are you sure it is wise to trust Tywin Lannister in any way? He will use your alliance, then cast you aside the moment it suits him. Robb exhaled. Perhaps. But for now, we share a common enemy. If we do not meet that enemy together, we might see all the 7 kingdoms consumed in fire and blood. I will not allow the North to fall. I will not have my men dragged through endless war on multiple fronts. The Targaryen host, if it includes dragons, at the mention of dragons, Catelyn's eyes flickered. They say Daenerys hatched them. Word travels like a plague, but so far, only rumor. And as for Jon, no one expected him to press a Targaryen claim. But he has, Robb said. And he draws men from all corners of Westeros seeking a unifying cause. If I hope to preserve the North's independence, or at least its welfare, I must remove the biggest threat. The Lannisters are still powerful for all their cruelty. If Tywin sees Jon as the bigger danger, perhaps he'll make terms. I will wring from them new concessions. The North and Riverlands left to rule themselves, and we can turn to face this new Targaryen alliance. He saw the struggle in her face, the war between maternal grief and the faint hope that saving Sansa, saving Arya, and saving Rickon might become easier with a Lannister alliance. Catelyn stared back at Robb with eyes heavy as if to say, the cost is too high. But she did not forbid him. His father's blood and the burdens of kingship rested on his shoulders now. Robb leaned in and kissed her cheek. I'll do what I can to protect our family. He walked away before she could voice any final protest. He descended the tower steps, feeling each footfall resonate with the heaviness of his decision. What if he was wrong? What if turning to the Lannisters was a betrayal of all his father stood for? But the memory of Ned Stark's head on a spike in King's Landing haunted him. Perhaps the realm was no place for illusions of pure honor. His father had believed in justice, yet that justice had not saved him from the headsman's sword. The realm was in chaos, and maybe, just maybe, forming this alliance was the only path forward. In the courtyard, the Greyjohn's men parted to let him approach. Jaime Lannister took in Robb's visage with a lazy half-smile, though his eyes were alert. King in the North, Jaime said with a mocking bow. What fine morning business do we have, you and I? I've come to speak with you, Robb replied, ignoring the provocation. Are you still your father's favored son? Or has your captivity lessened your standing in House Lannister's eyes? Jaime shrugged, a roll of his shoulders that made him appear too comfortable. I'm my father's heir, for what that's worth. At least until Tyrion finds another scheme to overshadow me. But why do you ask such a question? Concern for my future doesn't suit you. I ask because I intend to free you. That caught Jaime's attention fully. The Kingslayer's smirk froze. The courtyard quieted around them, men pausing in mid-swing of swords to observe the confrontation. Free me, Jaime repeated. He took a breath, let it out slowly. And what do you want in return? My father's head on a plate? My sister in shackles? You can't expect me to go meekly to Lord Tywin and say, we've reached a delightful arrangement, please sign here. Robb found a well of calm in himself, a determination that steadied his voice. No, I want your father's armies to abandon the field against the North and Riverlands. I want peace between us, and I want the Lannisters to stand with me against Jon Targaryen. The silence lengthened. Even the stable boy paused his sweeping, straw and dust swirling around his ankles. Jaime let out a soft laugh. Extraordinary. The king in the North extends a hand to the Kingslayer to forge an alliance. And you want us to fight a Targaryen pretender? I have to say, there's a certain poetry in it. There was a time my father fought to keep the Targaryens from returning to power well after we toppled the Mad King. But what of your precious father's honor? You know what my family did to House Stark, what my son, Robb bristled at the mention of Joffrey, but he swallowed down the hot flood of anger. I told you what I want. My father is dead and the war between us has taken enough. If Jon Targaryen seizes the throne with dragons and the might of half the realm, your father will be dethroned from his seat of power as surely as the North will be overrun. Better the devil you know, Jaime Lannister, than the one you do not. Jaime's green eyes flicked around, measuring. You mean to use my father's resources, then turn on him once the Targaryen threat is gone. Robb did not flinch from the accusation. Tywin Lannister is not a fool. He will make his own assessments. Perhaps we each have half a reason to trust the other. Amusement danced in Jaime's gaze. Well, it's an interesting proposal, I'll grant you that. How will this arrangement free your sisters if they are still in King's Landing? I expect your father to do everything in his power to ensure their safety, Robb said. That is non-negotiable. He must see them released or smuggled out from under Queen Cersei's eyes. Or he must ensure their well-being. It's part of the terms. The Kingslayer nodded slowly as though absorbing a cunning move in attorney. You're betting a great deal on my father's willingness to make peace. He's not known for that, you see. He more often prefers vengeance, especially on those who capture his son. Then tell him, better to share victory than suffer defeat. We shall gather to face the Targaryen threat in open battle if it comes to that. Once we quell that, we can speak of the shape of peace between North and South. Jaime's lips pressed together. Then he raised his hands in a half-surrendering, half-dramatic flourish. I can't speak for him, but I'll carry your terms, assuming you mean truly to let me go. I do, Robb said, stepping forward. But know this, Jaime Lannister, if you betray me, if your father breaks faith, I swear by the old gods and the new, I will carve out the west with northern steel. We will burn Casterly Rock to the ground if you or yours dare cross us. Jaime's smile slanted. Good. Trust tempered by threats. My father would like that. Very well, King in the North. Release me and I'll go to him with your proposition. Robb turned to his guards. Send a raven to Tywin Lannister that his son rides forth with our terms and that we expect a sign of good faith in equal measure. The Greyjoy's men looked uncertain, but they followed orders without question. Jaime Lannister's expression was unreadable as he gave Robb one last measuring look and said softly, You may yet regret this, boy. Or it may be the stroke of brilliance that saves the realm. Either way, we shall see. Early the next morning, Robb stood at Riverrun's gates to watch Jaime depart. As a courtesy, or perhaps as a sign of confidence, Robb had allowed him a small retinue of freed Lannister soldiers, their armor and horses restored. The sigil of the Golden Lion gleamed anew on their shields. As Jaime swung astride a roan stallion, he shot Robb a cocky salute before riding off, disappearing into the morning haze. Left behind, Robb exhaled. In the distance, the riverlands stretched away, farmland and rivers scarred by war. He felt Catelyn's presence behind him, a silent condemnation or perhaps a silent hope. There was no turning back now. Days melted into weeks as they waited for Tywin's response. Tensions simmered, with lords of the North and Riverlands muttering that Robb had lost his wits, that he had freed the man who tried to murder Bran, that the Lannisters could not be trusted. Robb held his ground, pacing the corridors of Riverrun as crows arrived with scraps of news. Rumors that Jon Targaryen was forging an alliance with the Stormlords, that Daenerys Targaryen had indeed brought 3 young dragons across the sea, that the city of Sunspear was preparing to host Jon in a grand council with the Prince of Dorne. When at last Tywin's raven came, it was as curt and cold as expected. The Lord of Casterly Rock was willing to parley. He would meet with Robb Stark in neutral territory, Harrenhal. Robb wondered at the choice of that cursed fortress, but perhaps Tywin liked to display his power in places imbued with fearsome history. Robb sent word to the banners, gathering a strong enough escort to dissuade any Lannister treachery. In the end, he took a host of 3,000 knights and foot soldiers from the Riverlands, plus a contingent of Northmen led by Roose Bolton, who had grown eerily quiet and calculating since the news about Jon Targaryen. Balancing the council of men like Great Jon Umber and Roose was precarious, but Robb had no intention of being taken unawares at Harrenhal. At dawn on the day of departure, Robb knelt in prayer in Riverrun's Godwood. The weirwood tree's red leaves barely stirred in the faint breeze. If only he could feel his father's hand on his shoulder again, guiding him, or glimpse Bran's bright smile running through the halls of Winterfell. The weight of war pressed down on him. He touched the old trunk, and in his mind, he voiced a plea, I will do what I must to keep our people safe. If I must bargain with the Lannisters, so be it. Please let this not be a mistake. They marched for days, passing burnt farmsteads and hearing stories of bandits and stray soldiers scouring the countryside. War had brought hunger and terror to these lands. Seeing it, Robb's resolve hardened. When Harrenhal rose into view, the twisted spires and blackened stone loomed against a bruised sky. The fortress stood as a grim monument to Aegon's conquest, a ruin cursed by dragonfire and the ghosts of families who had once tried to hold it. Within its gargantuan walls, Tywin Lannister was camped with a force rumored to be nearly equal to Robb's. On the wide, trampled plain before the fortress, the 2 armies spread out, keeping a careful distance. Tents and banners bristled in the dull light. Dire wolves of Stark, Trout of Tully, flayed men of Bolton, golden lions of Lannister, all arrayed in a standoff that might erupt at any provocation. Thunder growled overhead when Robb rode forward with his retinue. Men parted to reveal a single figure on a magnificent warhorse clad in gilded plate, Tywin Lannister. The Lord of Casterly Rock was cold-faced, lines around his mouth deeper with age but no less imposing. To his left was Jaime, restored to armor and with his sword strapped to his hip. To his right stood Tyrion, the imp, peering at the field with quick, sharp eyes. Roose Bolton rode at Robb's side. The man was silent, but Robb sensed the crackle of tension in him. Catelyn had remained behind at Riverrun, but many other lords were present to bear witness, each of them watchful of the slightest shift in posture or tone. Robb dismounted a few paces from Tywin. Rain drizzled as though the gods wept for what might come next. Each side was flanked by knights with hands resting on their sword hilts. Tywin inclined his head a fraction. "King in the north," he said, voice resonant. "I trust your mother is well?" The question might have been a barb or perhaps a test of courtesy. Robb answered evenly, "She is as well as can be hoped in these times. My father's bones still wait to be buried in the crypts of Winterfell, thanks to your grandson's courtesy in King's Landing. But let us not bandy words too much. You are here. I am here. Let us speak of what must be done." Tywin's gaze was flinty. "Yes. You would have me call off my forces against the North and Riverlands and join you instead against Jon Targaryen, who now rallies a coalition. Why should I not crush you first and then deal with that pretender in due course?" Robb lifted his chin. "Because you've tried and you failed. You've lost battles, lost your prized son as a prisoner. You may pride yourself on your cunning, but even you cannot fight every threat alone. Jon Targaryen has the advantage of House Martell, and if rumors are true, the veil might shift to his side if Lord Robert Arryn is swayed by that cunning Peter Baelish. I've heard the Stormlands rally to him as well, not to mention the dragons under Daenerys Targaryen. You cannot hope to stand against all of that while also fighting the North. You need me." Tywin's lips tightened. Jaime gave his father a sidelong look. Tyrion cleared his throat, venturing, "It would seem wise, father, to consider King Robb's words carefully. I suspect we might find a mutual advantage in an alignment." A faint twitch in Tywin's jaw betrayed annoyance, but he nodded. "Very well. Suppose I accept this alignment. My men withdraw from the Riverlands, and we keep the trade routes to the north open. We march together against this Targaryen. What do the Lannisters gain from such an alliance?" Robb's eyes flicked to Jaime. "You keep your place as Lords Paramount of the Westerlands. Your alliances remain unbroken. You keep the seat of power in King's Landing for your grandson Tommen, or Myrcella if Tommen does not hold. In turn, you guarantee the North's freedom to rule itself and the Riverlands as my vassals or allies." Tywin's thin eyebrows rose. "An independent North and Riverlands? A large portion of the realm, I must note." "Yes," Robb agreed. "A large portion. But one you'd prefer as a friend rather than an enemy in these times." A silence settled, disturbed only by the wet snort of horses. From the corner of his eye, Robb noticed Tyrion's faint smirk, as if the dwarf appreciated the boldness. Jaime was stone-faced, though some flicker of amusement might have passed his eyes. Tywin spoke at last, his voice carrying across the clearing. "I will concede that we might do better to stand together against the Targaryen threat. The boy claims Rhaegar's blood, and the woman claims dragons. If they have the might of Dorne, we stand at a disadvantage in the south. The Vale might join them and the Stormlands. Yes, your counsel is not mistaken. Very well, Stark. I accept your terms, provided you fulfill one promise. Bend the knee to the Iron Throne once we defeat Targaryen. Your father was Warden of the North, after all. I cannot sign away half the realm's territory. If we are to appear unified, you must kneel to the crown." Robb's heart pounded. He forced his expression to remain impassive. "No, Lord Lannister. My father's wardenship ended when your savage grandson, Joffrey, executed him. By that act, you lost your hold over the North. If I stand with you, it is as an equal ally, not a vassal." Amid the hush, Tywin smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "You fancy yourself a king, then? A king must have a seat. Will you set yourself up in Winterfell, calling it an independent kingdom?" "Yes," said Robb, "and the Riverlands under me as well. Perhaps the price for my loyal tie is that I remain king in the North. It is that or we continue our war and Jon Targaryen will pick over the bones of whoever remains." Tension crackled. Roose Bolton inclined his head in a small gesture of agreement, though his eyes were unreadable. The Greyjoy's men behind him let out a faint grunt of approval. In the Lannister ranks, some lords grumbled at the audacity of letting the North remain a kingdom unto itself. Tyrion cleared his throat again, loudly this time. I believe we can find a suitable compromise. Perhaps a distinct autonomy for the north and riverlands within the Seven Kingdoms with a recognized kingship that pays nominal homage? There is precedent for Dorne retaining some measure of autonomy when it joined the realm, after all. Robb studied Tywin. I will not kneel before a Lannister king who took my father's head. But I will treat with you as an ally, and upon victory over Targaryen we can address the finer details of the North's status. If you renege, I will not rest until I have vengeance. Tywin was silent a moment longer. Then he gave a single stiff nod. We have an accord for now. Let the armies of the North and the West march together. Let us crush Jon Targaryen, and once that is done, we will settle the question of who rules what. It was not perfect. Robb knew he was making a pact with vipers. But it was something, a glimmer of unity in a fracturing realm. They rode within the black walls of Harrenhal and convened in the echoing throne room where giant melted pillars soared overhead like twisted hands. There, the lords of North and West formalized the pact, setting out the broad strokes of their terms: immediate ceasefire, mutual cooperation against House Targaryen, the promise of safe passage for each other's armies. Robb demanded the release of Sansa and Arya, or at least a guarantee of their safety. Tywin's mouth tightened, but he gave word that he would send instructions to Cersei. When all was done, Robb returned to his camp. Rain battered the tent roofs and the gloom of Harrenhal seemed to seep into every corner. Bolton entered Robb's tent with the soft footfalls of a man gliding on ice. "Sire," he said in that quiet voice. "Are you certain this is wise?" Robb turned, meeting that pale gaze. "Wise or not, it's what must be done. I won't risk the North's destruction on two fronts." Bolton inclined his head, an unreadable smile on his lips. "Indeed. Very prudent. One small matter, our armies must accept this alliance with the Lannisters. There are those who harbor deep grudges. The freedmen of the Dreffort, for one, lost kin to Lannister raids. The Greyjoy's men want revenge for your father's death. How will you quell their thirst for blood?" Robb felt the old heaviness. "We have to show them that the greater threat is the Targaryen with her dragons, with Jon at her side. A shift in allegiances might be the only way to keep the North free." Bolton gave another slight bow and departed. Robb stared after him, uneasy. There was something in the man's eyes that reminded him of a predator quietly assessing the best moment to strike. But for now, Bolton remained loyal enough, to the cause. They marched from Harrenhal the next day, each army returning to its own territory to consolidate. True to Tywin's word, Lannister forces pulled out of the Riverlands, allowing the battered populace a breath. Robb saw the relief on the faces of the small folk. Though they might fear the Lannisters' return, at least for a season, they would not have burning farms or pillaging outriders. Ravens flew back and forth with news of the Targaryen threat. Now that Daenerys had indeed landed in Dorne, her host was said to include several thousand spearmen of House Martell, plus the Unsullied she had acquired overseas. Worst of all, rumors insisted she had 3 live dragons, small yet, but powerful enough to strike terror into her enemies. Jon Targaryen, or Jon Stark Targaryen as some called him, was forging alliances by reminding lords that Eddard Stark had harbored him out of loyalty to Rhaegar's memory. Some said he wore black armor emblazoned with a wolf and dragon sigil entwined. The cunning of this new Targaryen faction lay in its ability to exploit resentments against the Lannisters. Robb expected an invasion from the south. For months, scouts prowled the roads leading out of the Red Mountains of Dorne, hearing rumors of columns marching. Meanwhile, Tywin gathered his main strength at King's Landing, fortifying it against a siege. Robb marched his men southward at a measured pace, sending outriders to coordinate with Lannister scouts. It was an uneasy alliance, but it held. Summer snows had not yet come to the north, but the chill air pressed down on them as they reached the outskirts of the Stormlands. The approach to King's Landing was littered with deserted villages, for war had sent the people fleeing. One morning, a raven arrived from the capital, a message from Tyrion Lannister, who had apparently traveled to King's Landing to handle the city's defenses. It read, "Jon Targaryen rumored to meet with storm lords near the ruins of Summerhall. Daenerys remains in Dorne for now. We must engage quickly or risk them uniting their forces." Robb moved at once. He pressed the bulk of his foot soldiers forward, linking them with a host of Lannister pikemen near the Blackwater Rush. Together, they advanced on Summerhall, that old burned ruin at the edge of the Stormlands. What they found was troubling, tents emblazoned with sigils of Storm's End, some bearing the fiery heart of Lawler if the rumors of Stannis' partial involvement were true, though that was uncertain. The Targaryen loyalists had begun to gather in small but potent numbers. Before the next dawn broke, a messenger galloped into the combined camp, breathless. "They're here," the rider gasped. "Jon Targaryen leads a vanguard. We saw their banners, dragons, and wolves." Robb felt a jolt, a swirl of emotion. The thought of facing Jon in battle, a brother in all but blood, made his stomach twist. But now that he knew the truth, that Jon was the son of Rhaegar Targaryen, heir to a dynasty, he could no longer see him as the boy from Winterfell. War was cruel. If Jon threatened the North's independence, threatened to upend the realm with dragons and Targaryen dominion, Robb would stand in his way. He gave swift orders. The men were to form ranks in the pre-dawn darkness. Torches flared, stirring restless shadows across the muddy ground. Lannister knights polished their armor with a dull, methodical clink. Northern archers strung their bows and tested arrowheads. Horses whinnied, unsettled by the tension. Morning light found them arrayed on the field outside Summerhall's charred ruins, a wide plain dotted with stunted trees, a few shallow hills, and the black skeleton of the old palace in the distance, half-collapsed walls crumbling into the weeds. Robb positioned the northern cavalry on the flanks, with a center line of spearmen and crossbowmen from the Riverlands. The Lannister knights formed up on the right flank, brazen lions on their standards, while Lannister foot soldiers integrated into the main line. Across from them, as the mist lifted, Robb could make out the Targaryen host. Their banners were a swirl of red and black, the three-headed dragon emblazoned proudly, but here and there he saw sigils of houses from the Stormlands, and even a few with a grey dire wolf entwined with a dragon, Jon's personal banner, presumably. The vanguard was led by a group of knights with silver insignias. Robb tried to spot Jon among them. A horn call echoed. The Targaryen line began advancing at a steady pace, their ranks well-ordered. Robb's heart thudded. In the distance, the black shape of something wheeled in the sky, a dragon? For an instant, panic threatened to grip his men. But the shape vanished behind a bank of clouds. Robb signaled a slow advance, aiming to maintain formation. The ground was soft from recent rains, so cavalry charges would be difficult. He felt Grey Wind's presence at his side, the direwolf pacing with ears laid back, lips curled. Grey Wind sensed the tension, too, as if anticipating the bloodshed to come. The armies closed. Archers on both sides loosed arrows that darkened the sky, and the world exploded into cries of pain and splintering wood. Men shouted, horses screamed, and the air filled with the acrid tang of blood. Robb roared for his men to hold formation. On the right, Lannister knights lowered lances and thundered forward, smashing into a line of Stormland footmen. Spears bristled to meet them, steel clashing against steel. In the swirl of chaos, Robb saw a cluster of Targaryen horsemen break away from the main line, aiming to flank the Lannisters. "To me," he shouted, spurring his mount. A rush of Northmen followed, their war cries rising. Robb led a furious charge that intercepted the flanking maneuver, colliding with the Targaryen riders in a ringing crash of metal. Sword met shield and men toppled from their saddles. Through the clangor, Robb glimpsed a figure in black armor trimmed with gold, a cloak of red pinned at the shoulders. The man's helm bore the three-headed dragon sigil. As Robb clashed swords with a Targaryen bannerman, he saw that figure raise his visor. Jon Snow, no, Jon Targaryen. Robb recognized the pale face, the dark hair matted with sweat. Their eyes met across the chaotic tide of the battle. A heartbeat thundered in Robb's ears, memories of Winterfell flooding back, training yard sparring sessions, stolen laughter in the Godwood, the camaraderie he had shared with Jon, side by side as brothers. Now they faced each other on opposite sides of a field slick with blood. Jon, eyes narrowed, spurred his horse forward, forging a path through the melee. Robb cut down another knight, then pulled on his reins to disengage from the swirling mass, meeting Jon halfway. Their horses circled, hooves pounding the churned mud. Neither spoke at first, shock, regret, anger, all compressed into that single moment. Finally, Robb said in a strained voice, "Jon, you needn't do this." Jon's sword was clenched in his gauntlet hand. "I've heard the rumors," he said, "that you allied with the Lannisters. The men who killed your father, my uncle. The men who tried to murder your brother. What have you done?" The words stung like a lash. "I've done what I must to protect the North." "You ally with tyrants against your own blood?" Jon said, face a mask of betrayal. "You know that the Lannisters want the throne, that they have murdered and maimed. And you stand with them over me, your brother." Robb felt his throat tighten. "Brother," he began, then shook his head. "We learned the truth, Jon. You are Rhaegar's son, a Targaryen. You claim the Iron Throne. I cannot risk the North's freedom, cannot see it subjugated to a new Targaryen dynasty, no matter who sits that throne." Jon's eyes flickered with sorrow or perhaps desperation. "I never wanted any throne. But it is my birthright, and the realm deserves a just ruler, not a Lannister tyrant. I was going to offer you peace, offer the North the right to govern itself under my crown. But you've chosen the Lannisters. They are the lesser evil, Robb spat back, though it tasted bitter in his mouth. And they have the resources to help hold the north against your dragons and your southern lords. A flicker of anger crossed Jon's face. Is that what you've been told? That I intend to burn the north? You know me better than that, or you should. Says the man who marched with Daenerys Targaryen and her Unsullied with the Martells at his side, Robb said, trying to quell the swirl of doubt. If I hadn't found an ally, you'd cast the north to the flames the moment we refused to bend the knee to your dragon banners. Jon's jaw tightened. Behind him, the swirl of battle continued, soldiers wrestling in the mud, screams splitting the air. Then you leave me no choice, Jon said. Stand aside, or I will do what I must. His voice cracked at the end, betraying the emotion beneath. Robb felt his heart pound. Here they were, once brothers, forced to the cusp of mortal combat by the relentless logic of war. I cannot stand aside, Robb said hoarsely. Yield, Jon. For your sake and for the realm's. If you continue, the Lannisters will kill you, and Jon let out a ragged cry, spurred his horse forward, and swung his blade. The ring of steel on steel echoed. Robb barely parried, the shock jolting up his arms. They circled each other, swords meeting in a blur. Robb realized with distant amazement that Jon was nearly his equal in skill now, perhaps all that training on the wall or with Rhaegar's rumored tutors in secret had honed him. Robb's warhorse snorted, stamping at the muddy ground while Jon maneuvered deftly. They traded blows. The thunder of the battlefield receded, leaving them in a surreal bubble of their own conflict, swirling past the ruins of Summerhall. To Robb, it felt like a nightmare he could not escape. A savage blow from Jon nearly tore Robb from the saddle. Robb retaliated with a slash across Jon's shoulder, biting into the black plate. Jon hissed but stayed upright. Horses wheeled, mud flew. Then, in a blinding rush of wings and flame, the sky split open. Above them, a young dragon swooped, letting loose a torrent of fire that scorched a section of the field. Men screamed, scattering. Robb's horse reared, shrieking. Jon seized the moment to break away, looking to the skies. Smoke billowed as the dragon soared overhead, tail lashing. It was not full-grown, but large enough to sow terror among the ranks. Robb's men scrambled in disarray, shouting that the Targaryens had unleashed their beasts. Lannister knights tried to regroup, but the flames set their banners ablaze. Shouts of retreat or rally meshed into chaos. Jon, face twisted with conflicting emotions, called out to Robb over the roar of flames, I didn't want this. But Daenerys has unleashed them, stand aside. Please. Robb fought down the panic of seeing the dragon wreak havoc. I can't, he croaked. He remembered the unsaid vow, I am king in the north, I swore to protect my people. He raised his sword again. But before either could re-engage, a fresh wave of Targaryen cavalry thundered into the fray. A Lannister trumpeter sounded a desperate retreat call. Robb saw the lines buckling. He had to maintain the integrity of the army or they would be routed. With one last painful look at Jon, Robb spurred his horse to rally the northern ranks. Jon did the same for his Targaryen host. All across the battlefield, men died. Northern archers loosed volley after volley at the dragon as it circled overhead, but the creature's scales seemed to deflect most shafts. The stench of burning flesh choked the air. Lannister knights, hammered by Targaryen foot soldiers, fought in pockets of furious melee. By midday, both armies were near exhaustion. Bodies littered the ground, and black smoke curled from smoldering fires. Robb managed to regroup with a contingent of his Northmen on a low hill. He saw the Targaryen line pulling back slightly, perhaps to reorganize. The dragon soared away, presumably to find Daenerys or rest. The cost of that brief flight had been horrendous, scores of men torched in seconds. And it was only a young dragon. What about the other two, rumored to be out there as well? Tywin Lannister emerged from the swirl of dust, his gilded armor streaked with ash. He dismounted stiffly, eyes aflame. Stark, he hissed, if you have a plan to deal with those beasts, now is the time. Or your precious north will be cinders along with the rest of us. Robb grimaced. He had no illusions about controlling a dragon. I have no plan to kill a dragon. Perhaps your men have scorpions or ballistae. But do we have time to build them or bring them here? Tywin's gaze hardened. We might if we retreat. But we cannot yield the field entirely. The Targaryen foothold grows each day. Jaime Lannister, splattered in mud, rode up. The men are shaken, father. We need to consolidate or we'll be routed. Retreat to higher ground, Tywin said. Send outriders with word to King's Landing. We need those siege engines, whatever Qyburn has contrived. Robb turned, scanning for Jon in the distance. He glimpsed a figure in black armor among a ring of knights, but they were too far away. Then the horns sounded again, and both sides began a cautious disengagement. The battlefield was so ravaged and soaked in blood, no side could force a decisive conclusion that day. At dusk, the Targaryen host pulled back toward the shell of Summerhall while the Lannister-Stark alliance withdrew to a wooded ridge. Robb set sentries and collapsed onto a bedroll in a command tent, his mind spinning with the day's horrors. Grey wind prowled close, whining softly at the smell of burnt flesh. Sleep was fitful. Dreams tossed Robb through halls of Winterfell where Jon stood accusing him, wearing the black and red of House Targaryen, his eyes the color of molten gold. Ghosts of Ned and Lyanna whispered half-formed warnings. When he jerked awake, the camp was tense with men exchanging low, hushed talk of dragons, of unstoppable Targaryen magic. Dawn brought a new wave of movement. Scouts informed Robb that the Targaryen host was splitting, with one contingent heading north, possibly to secure a route through the Kingswood, while another, led by Daenerys herself, was said to be skirting the Stormlands. The field near Summerhall still reeked, a mass grave. The local lords were refusing to join either side wholeheartedly, fearful of the devastation. Robb's meeting with Tywin was brief and terse. Both agreed they must force Jon into a decisive engagement before the dragons grew bigger or the Targaryen coalition rallied more lords. The plan: slip around Jon's flank, push him into pitched battle on ground of their choosing, and rely on anti-dragon artillery from King's Landing. Tywin insisted that certain modifications to scorpions or ballistae might bring down a dragon. And so it was that Robb found himself leading the Northmen once more into the storm. Days of maneuvering passed, with forced marches and skirmishes in the wooded hills. Rumors of Jon's presence flitted around. One day he was near Bronzegate, the next near Griffin's Roost. The constant tension grated on Robb, wearing him down. He found a small measure of solace in Grey Wind's companionship and in the knowledge that, for the moment, the Riverlands and the North were free of Lannister depredations. For the moment. News arrived that Daenerys was moving north at last, her dragons in tow, meaning soon the Targaryen armies might unite. Tywin demanded they intercept before the union. Taking advantage of their interior lines, the Lannister-Stark alliance marched hard. Scouts finally found Jon encamped near a crossing of the Windwater. There, in a broad clearing, the two sides arrayed yet again for battle. As men drew up in columns, Robb could feel the hush that fell over the host, a sense of finality. This confrontation might decide the future of the realm, Targaryen or Lannister-Stark. Snow hung in the air, though it was not truly winter, an unseasonable cold that seeped into every bone. The sky loomed dark as if awaiting some cataclysm. Positioned at the forefront, Robb could see the Targaryen banners snapping in a gust. He could see the silhouettes of two dragons perched on rocky outcrops near the Treeline. Small, but large enough to incinerate ranks of men. One was black-scaled with hints of red, the other greenish bronze. The third, rumored to be white and gold, was presumably patrolling elsewhere or with day. Nares. Tywin's plan hinged on luring the dragons into range of newly modified scorpions, heavy war machines with thick bolts said to be able to pierce a dragon's hide. Lannister engineers set them up behind lines of pikemen, the metal tips gleaming with lethal promise. The men operating them looked pale but determined. Trumpets blared. The Targaryen line advanced. At its head, Robb saw Jon again, helmet off, dark hair whipped by the wind. Even at a distance, Robb sensed the anguish in Jon's stance. This was a war neither truly wanted. But neither could yield. The first clash came with a thunder of cavalry on the flanks, a swirling melee of screaming horses and spears. The center erupted in a surge of foot soldiers, metal scraping and hacking. The Targaryen banners soared as knights in black plate with red trim smashed into lines of Northmen. Robb waited in sword singing. He fought with a lethal grace, guided by adrenaline and the savage memory of everything he had lost. Soon came the roar from above, dragons. One swooped low, spouting a gush of flame that sent lines of men scrambling. But Tywin's scorpions answered, launching massive bolts. The first volley missed, the second volley grazed a dragon's flank, and the beast screeched in fury, veering off. The men cheered in half-hysterical triumph. Amid the chaos, Robb glimpsed Jon again. This time, Jon was on foot, leading a charge through a gap in the lines. Grey Wind snarled and lunged, driving men away from Robb's flank. Robb cut a path toward Jon, half dreading the confrontation. They met once more. Jon's eyes shone with tears unspilled. His sword was red with gore. "Robb," he gasped, voice almost lost in the din, "if you stand aside, if you throw down your arms, I swear on all the old gods and the new, the North will be free, just do not let the Lannisters use you as their shield." Robb clenched his jaw, words tearing at him. "You swear I can keep the North free?" Jon nodded fiercely. "I do." In that heartbeat, Robb felt his resolve waver. Was that not what he wanted, to secure the North's freedom? But Tywin, the Lannisters would never let them slip away if they turned on them now. He thought of Sansa, possibly in Lannister custody, Arya's fate still unknown. He thought of the alliances he had formed. To turn on the Lannisters now might doom them all. "They have my sisters," Robb said, voice thick. "Can you guarantee their lives?" Jon hesitated, chest heaving. I cannot promise what Cersei will do, but if you stand with me, we'll find a way." A fresh wave of Targaryen spearmen charged in. Robb barely parried a thrust. Grey wind leapt onto a man, tearing him down. Jon was driven back by the press of bodies, forced to break away. Robb felt the moment slip, replaced by the unstoppable momentum of battle. Then overhead, a terrible shriek. The second dragon dived. Flaming arcs whooshed across the battlefield. Lannister archers broke ranks, running in terror. Tywin himself was in the thick of it, bellowing orders. The scorpions launched again. One bolt struck home, piercing the dragon's flank. The beast screamed, losing altitude. It crashed near the Targaryen lines, writhing and spewing jets of flame that ignited both friend and foe alike in a chaotic swirl. Robb reeled, the shockwave of heat engulfing him. He coughed, eyes streaming. Through the roiling smoke, he saw Jon shouting in horror, trying to reach the wounded dragon. Then Tywin's knights, seeing an opening, charged with lances couched, driving into the Targaryen ranks in an effort to scatter them further. Jon was forced to retreat or be trampled. The day stretched on, a savage grind of men, steel, and roaring beasts. In the end, the Targaryen lines gave way. Daenerys' second dragon was wounded, possibly dying, and the threat of the scorpions drove the other away. Robb, battered and caked in blood, joined Tywin in pressing forward. By dusk, the Targaryen host was in full retreat to the west. It was a grim victory. Thousands lay dead or dying. The Lannister-Stark alliance emerged triumphant, yet shaken by the raw, destructive power of dragons. Robb scanned the smoke-shrouded field, searching for Jon's body among the fallen but did not find it. He suspected Jon had escaped. In the subsequent days, Tywin's posture changed. With the Targaryen forces scattered, and one dragon rumored to be mortally wounded, he sensed an opportunity to press an advantage. "We must pursue now," he insisted. "Drive them out of the Stormlands. Force Daenerys and Jon to seek refuge in Dorne, where they cannot menace the Crown lands." Robb was torn. His men were weary and bled. Yet if they let Jon regroup, the war might continue indefinitely. So he acquiesced. The pursuit was relentless. Bolstered by fresh reinforcements from King's Landing, Tywin pressed onward, scouring the Stormlands for pockets of Targaryen sympathizers. Robb's Northmen, though exhausted, marched under the banner of the direwolf side by side with the lion. Gradually, rumors spread that Daenerys had retreated behind the formidable passes into Dorne, her dragons with her, while Jon had vanished. Some said he was seeking the support of the Vale or going north to rally more Targaryen loyalists. Others claimed he had gone to treat with the Iron Islands, as the Greyjoys might be swayed by cunning promises. The war was far from over, but Tywin used the lull to cement his power in King's Landing. Cersei Lannister retained her influence, though Joffrey was dead, slain by a suspicious poisoning. So the official story said. Tommen sat the throne as the Boy King, with Tywin as hand. Sansa Stark was still in the capital, betrothed now to some minor alliance, or so the talk went. The exact details seemed hazy, but Robb received word that she was alive. As for Arya, no one knew. When Tywin summoned Robb to the Red Keep to discuss the next phase of the war, Robb arrived with a personal guard. He had not stepped foot in King's Landing since before his father's death. Now, passing beneath the towering walls, he recalled the day Ned was executed, the howling crowds, the sickening cheer that had accompanied that monstrous act. Even in forging an alliance with the Lannisters, the memory would never fade. Tyrion Lannister greeted him in the throne room with a wry smile. "King Robb," he said, "I trust your ride from the Stormlands was not too arduous. We've had an influx of refugees, all speaking of dragons and Targaryens, which quite sets the city on edge. Robb inclined his head. I'm here for your father. Of course, best not to keep him waiting. The throne room was less crowded than usual. Tywin stood at the foot of the Iron Throne, discussing something with Pycelle. Tommen perched on the throne itself, looking every bit a child forced to wear a crown too heavy for his small head. Lannister guards flanked every pillar. Tywin turned, a thin smile ghosting his lips. King Robb, we stand on the precipice of a new age for the realm. The Targaryens are battered. With one more decisive campaign, we can end them for good. And then, Robb asked, you promised to settle the terms for the North's freedom. Tywin paused, his cold green eyes raking over Robb. Yes, the North's status. Perhaps you should kneel now and affirm loyalty to the Iron Throne under my grandson Tommen, in exchange for broad autonomy. Robb felt the old anger stirring, but he tempered it. Autonomy or independence? Is there truly a difference if we do not meddle? Tywin said, arching a brow. King Tommen remains your liege, but we will recognize the North's right to govern itself. You have my word. Robb glanced at Tommen. The boy looked uncertain, glancing at Tywin for reassurance. Robb thought of the men who had died to keep the North free. This was not the moment to let pride overshadow strategy. Perhaps a nominal vow of loyalty might serve if it guaranteed real independence in all but name. If I swear to King Tommen, Robb said, voice echoing, I demand a written charter guaranteeing the North's right to its own armies, its own laws, and its own wards. My people will not be taxed or levied by the crown without my consent. Tywin's jaw tightened. A generous arrangement for you. Generous but fair, Robb replied. My father died for the realm. The North deserves this measure of security after all that has happened. Silence lengthened. At last, Tywin nodded. Very well, if that is what it takes to preserve unity against the Targaryens. I will have our scribes draw up the documents. Robb's relief was overshadowed by an abiding distrust. Yet it seemed the best arrangement possible for the moment. Tyrion, ever perceptive, offered a conciliatory smile. Shall we celebrate this alliance then? The North and the West forging a new era in the Seven Kingdoms. I'll celebrate, Robb said stiffly. Once Jon Targaryen surrenders, and my sisters are safe, not a moment before. Tywin inclined his head. You'll have your chance. We are already gathering for a push into Dorne if Daenerys will not yield. And if your cousin or brother, whatever he is, dares to raise arms again, we shall crush him once and for all. Robb stared at the older man, his heart cold. If Jon rose again, if he came with the might of the Vale or the Iron Islands, they would be forced to fight. And each time, it would be brother's blood against brother's blood, no matter the truth of their lineage. Quietly, Robb said, he was my brother in all ways that mattered. Tywin's eyes flicked, possibly with a hint of pity or confusion. Perhaps not. This is the Game of Thrones, Stark. Sentiment has no place here. You've already proven you understand that by freeing Jaime. Robb's fingers tightened around the pommel of his sword. I have done what I must, yes. In the days and weeks that followed, the realm braced for another campaign. Scouts reported that Daenerys was fortifying Sunspear with the help of House Martell. Jon's whereabouts remained uncertain, though scattered rumors placed him in the Vale. Tension soared as Tywin prepared to march on Dorne, intending to crush the last major Targaryen stronghold. Robb was expected to bring his men as well. Sansa's safety was promised in exchange for his continued cooperation. And so the war ground on. Robb Stark, king in the north, marched under the direwolf banner side by side with the Golden Lion of Lannister, determined to ensure that if Targaryen power was ended, the North would remain free. He knew that in many eyes he was a traitor to the memory of Ned Stark, an oathbreaker, an ally of those who had wrought so much harm upon his family. But the alternative was to watch the realm fall into the old cycle of fire and blood. Each passing day, the price weighed heavier on Robb's soul. He remembered the fierce loyalty he once had for Jon, the quiet brother who had been so close to him. Now they were enemies in a greater war of crowns and claims, a war that devoured love and kinship as easily as a dragon's flame devoured armies. If Jon reappeared with an army at his back, there would be no easy choice. Yet for all the sorrow and guilt, a part of Robb refused to yield. He would see the North safe. He would see an end to the slaughter, even if it meant forging a pact with the Lannisters, even if it meant sharpening his sword against Jon Targaryen, even if that final betrayal scarred him beyond healing. On the eve of the march toward Dorne, Robb stood on a balcony of the Red Keep, overlooking Blackwater Bay. The night sky was clouded, moonlight faint. He thought of Winterfell, of the heart tree in the God's Wood, of how the wind sounded whispering through the pines. He whispered a silent prayer to the old gods that they grant him the strength to finish what he had begun and to spare those he loved from the butcher's blade. A voice spoke from the shadows behind him. "It's a rare thing, seeing a Stark so far south." Robb turned to find Tyrion Lannister, a goblet in hand. The imp's mismatched eyes gleamed with curiosity. "You did what few thought possible," Tyrion said, "allying with my father. The realm shakes in the balance." Robb said nothing, only stared at the shimmering black waters of the bay. Tyrion sighed. "I shall not keep you long. I only wanted to say, be cautious. My father has never been known for kindness nor for respecting those who might one day challenge him. If you succeed in Dorne, you will be at the height of your power. My father may decide that is too great a power for any but him to wield." Robb's gut twisted. He thought again of Roose Bolton, of the Great Jon, of all the northern lords who followed him. If Tywin turned on him once the Targaryens were vanquished, the carnage would be unimaginable. Yet there was no turning back. "If he betrays me," Robb said, his voice quiet but ironclad, "then I will avenge the North. Even if I have to tear down Casterly Rock stone by stone." Tyrion's mouth curved in a rueful smile. "I see. Then let us hope it never comes to that." The dwarf drained his goblet and walked away, leaving Robb alone on the balcony. The night wind tugged at Robb's cloak, teasing him with phantom whispers. Far to the south, Daenerys's dragons grew larger with every passing day, while Jon, somewhere, somehow would not cease in his quest to claim his rightful throne. Robb gazed at the distant horizon, imagining the black wings of dragons silhouetted against the moon. He had chosen his path. No matter how it weighed on his heart, he would follow it to the bitter end. If it meant wearing a crown of northern ice while standing beside a golden lion, if it meant crossing steel with Jon once more, so be it. Such was the cost of ruling in a realm where hearts burned brighter than logic, and dragons soared above the moil of mortal ambitions. He lifted his head, praying silently that when the final clash came, he would still have something left of himself, something that was not stained beyond redemption. But the war had only begun, and like the ghostly wind that whistled through the battlements, it would not relent until every debt of blood was paid. Robb Stark rose at dawn on the day the combined host would march for Dorne. The wind along the Blackwater carried a briny tang, rippling the banners of House Stark and House Lannister in a strange, uneasy union. His camp lay on the outskirts of King's Landing, pitched in orderly rows that testified to the discipline of northern men. Great Jon Umber's boisterous laughter rose now and then among the tents, while the quieter river lords conferred in murmured circles. Many turned faces of mingled respect and resentment upon their king as he passed. They had pledged their steel to him, but the cost of marching under the same banner as the Lannisters still weighed heavily on their honor. In Robb's personal tent, he carefully strapped on his vambraces and tested the fit of his boiled leather tunic, worn beneath a layer of fine mail. Gray wind prowled restlessly at the entrance, sniffing each passerby. A small mirror of polished steel showed Robb's reflection, a face harder than it had been when he'd first ridden south to save his father, the jaw set with tension, blue eyes older. He saw a man forging himself into the shape demanded by war. He stepped out, greeted by the muffled bustle of armies preparing to depart. In the distance, he could see the silhouette of the Red Keep. Down one winding road, lines of Lannister soldiers were already forming, commanded by a coterie of knights in gilded armor. Robb did not see Tywin among them yet. Likely the Lord of Casterly Rock would depart behind a strong guard, overshadowing all with his authority. Roose Bolton was waiting near the horse lines, silent as a wraith, his pale eyes fixed on Robb, polite but distant. "Sire," Bolton said quietly, his voice just audible above the clang of harnesses. "The men are assembled. We've scrounged enough provisions for 10 days' march. After that, we must rely on local supplies. Robb nodded. Make sure the men have everything they need to travel swiftly. We won't want to linger on the Rose Road for too long, not with Targaryen sympathizers still at large. Some Stormland lords remain on the fence. A slow approach invites raids and ambushes. Bolton inclined his head. Indeed, sire. But we must also be wary of the heat. Not all northern men handle the southern climate well, and Dorne will be worse. The scorched dunes, the red mountains, I know, Robb said, impatience bleeding into his tone. But we have no choice if we're to ensure the Targaryens do not rebuild their strength. We strike before Daenerys can rally fresh allies. Bolton's lips curved slightly. As you say. Near them, Grey John Umber led a few foot soldiers in a body-marching chant. They thumped the butts of spears on the ground in a steady rhythm. Despite the levity, Robb sensed the tension in their eyes when they glanced at the Lannister columns forming on the adjacent field. The memory of Ned Stark's death remained raw for these men, as did the knowledge that Casterly Rock's gold had funded so many outrages in the War of the Five Kings. But the vow they had given was to the king in the north, and so they would follow him even if he led them side by side with lions. The army of the Trident, the portion of river lords now sworn to Robb, had fared worse in prior campaigns, their lands ravaged by conflict. Nevertheless, Lord Edmure Tully had contributed men anxious to restore some measure of peace to the Riverlands. Edmure himself stayed behind to shore up defenses, but many of his knights marched under Robb's command. By mid-morning, Tywin Lannister finally emerged from the city's gates, accompanied by a retinue that glittered with gold. Jaime rode at his side, wearing a slight smile, as though halfway amused by the entire enterprise. Rows of knights with scarlet cloaks and lion-crested helms fanned out behind them. In the center of that formation walked the new mechanical scorpions, heavy wagons bearing the ballistae rumored to pierce Dragonhide. The sight of them sent anxious whispers through the ranks, for the men who had witnessed the scorpions in battle near Summerhall recognized both their power and their limitations. Robb mounted his destrier, a dark gray stallion that twitched its ears at gray wind. The dire wolf let out a short, low growl, scanning the lines for threats. Tywin inclined his head toward Robb in greeting, cold and precise. "We ride," he said, as though addressing no one in particular. "There is no time for ceremony." With a unified blast of horns, the enormous host began moving south. The roads near King's Landing became a churn of hooves and boots, wagons clattering, banners snapping. Smoke from the city's chimneys curled upward, and the waters of the Blackwater gleamed under the rising sun. They made their way down the Rose Road, that famed highway of the Reach. Yet even traveling in such large numbers, the land felt uneasy. Along the edges of the route, peasants peered from behind hedges or broken fences, gazing at the strangest alliance they might ever see, northerners side by side with men of the Westerlands. Some spat or muttered curses under their breath, for the small folk had known too much war already, and no matter the victor, they often paid the price. Camps sprang up each night, with strict boundaries separating Lannister soldiers and northern men. Though they were allies on parchment, centuries of enmity and recent bloodshed could not simply vanish. Patrols roamed to keep drunken brawls from erupting. Still, tension simmered. Robb made a habit of walking the perimeter, gray wind at his side, to remind his men that he watched and would not tolerate feuds. On the fourth evening, Robb stewed near a small bonfire, picking at the salted pork and hard bread that was their supper, when Jaime Lannister approached. The Kingslayer's polished breastplate reflected the dancing flames, and his golden hair was tied back in a short queue. He offered a half-smile, carefully measured. "It's odd, is it not? You and I, once mortal enemies, now standing in the same campfire's glow, heading off to kill Targaryens." Robb's gaze flicked toward him. "I do what I must. My father's memory and the safety of my people matter more than vengeance." Jaime let out a faint, wry laugh. "Still, it's quite the turn. You have the look of a man who's grown far older than his years. War is a cruel teacher, but a thorough one." Robb felt a prickle of irritation, yet he suppressed it. "I might say the same of you, Kingslayer. You don't appear quite so cocksure as when we first captured you." Jaime's lips curved in a grin that did not entirely reach his eyes. "Perhaps captivity taught me humility. A little. And the war has shown me that everything can change in a moment." A short silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of fire and the distant murmur of men bedding down. Robb finally said, "How fares your sister in King's Landing? Is she still queen in all but name?" Jaime shrugged. "Cersei is Cersei. Now that Tommen is on the throne, she dotes upon him, but the game continues. She must share power with our father and the council. Given that Joffrey is gone, he trailed off. Robb could see the flicker of something in Jaime's expression, regret, or perhaps relief at Joffrey's demise. Did you ever find out who truly killed Joffrey? Robb asked. The realm whispered many theories. Some said Tyrion had done it, others whispered of Lady Olenna Tyrell, and still others that Tywin himself had orchestrated it to remove a liability. Jaime's face revealed nothing. It is a mystery, he said lightly, though his eyes hinted he believed otherwise. Whoever it was, they did the realm a favor. He was a monster, whatever his parentage. Robb gave a soft grunt. Indeed, Joffrey's cruelty had ended Ned Stark's life. One less threat to my sisters if Arya is even in the city. Jaime's gaze wandered. My father claims that only Sansa remains in King's Landing. I've not seen her personally. If she is indeed your sister, I suspect she's being treated politely but kept under watch. Cersei is not one to let go of a valuable hostage. Robb's fists tightened. Every day that Sansa remained a captive weighed on him. Tywin assured me he would guarantee her safety. I hope for his sake he keeps his promise. Jaime spread his hands in a conciliatory gesture. If there's one thing to trust about my father, it's that he honors his bargains so long as they remain useful to him. Your continued cooperation in this war is likely incentive enough. Robb studied Jaime's face by firelight, searching for duplicity. He sensed caution and some measure of sincerity. I'm not fool enough to imagine all is well. But for now, our goals align. That's all that matters. A flicker of a smirk touched Jaime's lips. Just so. He gave a short bow, more mocking than respectful, and strode off into the night, leaving Robb to brood. Grey wind pressed close, sniffing after Jaime with distrust. Robb stroked the direwolf's fur. One day, we'll be free of them, he murmured, though a small voice in his mind questioned how and when that day might come. When the host drew near the Dornish marches, the air changed. The nights grew warmer, insects droned among the sparse brush, and rocky ridges replaced the gentler slopes of the Reach. Once, these borderlands had been fiercely contested territory. Castles like Nightsong and Black Haven dotted the crags, bastions that had withstood many a siege. Some of the local lords had sworn fealty to the Iron Throne still, but others were rumored to be discreetly lending aid to the Targaryens. Scouts reported that Daenerys Targaryen was indeed behind the passes into Dorne, possibly at Sunspear or near Sandstone, gathering fresh recruits from House Martell. The route through the Prince's Pass or the Bone Way would be harsh, and if the Dornish wanted to contest it, they could slow the Lannister-Stark host to a crawl. Worse, the dragons could harass them from the skies. Tywin called a war council in the ruins of an old watchtower near the boundary of the marches. Robb attended, flanked by Bolton, Great John Umber, and a handful of river lords. Tywin was accompanied by Jaime as well as a dar-faced Lannister cousin named Daven, who commanded some heavy cavalry. Tyrion was absent, remaining in King's Landing to handle matters of governance. Maps were spread on a makeshift table weighed down by stones. Torches guttered in the hot wind that swept across the ancient battlements. The men stood in a ragged circle, voices echoing from the cracked stone walls. Tywin ran a gauntlet hand over the map, indicating two major approaches into Dorne. We can attempt the Bone Way, he said, his tone clipped. It is narrower but shorter, a single pass that leads directly to the Stone Way. However, I expect it to be heavily fortified by Dornish spearmen and possibly Targaryen loyalists. The advantage is that if we break through, we're closer to Sunspear. Robb studied the lines on the map. And the Prince's Pass? Wider, with more possible routes. But that also means more ground to cover and more angles for ambush, Tywin answered. House Fowler's seat lies near there, and they are rumored to be staunch Targaryen supporters. They might sally forth to harass us. The same is true of House Manwoody in the vicinity and House Jourdain, not to mention the possibility that Daenerys might unleash her dragons from overhead. Jaime tapped a finger on a spot labeled Skirich. I'd wager House Fowler would see us coming miles away. They know every canyon, every vantage. If we push through, we could be bled the entire way. Roose Bolton's voice slid into the conversation. We have the advantage of numbers and the Scorpions, if we can keep them operational in that terrain. But if we're forced into narrow defile, the Scorpions might be more hindrance than help. The dragons could strike from above, and in close quarters we cannot effectively aim. Robb gazed at the ring of faces. Is there no chance for negotiation with House Martell? The Martells hate the Lannisters for what was done to Elia and her children during the sack of King's Landing. They might not be swayed, but perhaps if we offer them the chance to keep Dorne independent. Tywin's glare was ice. That is not an option. Dorne must be brought to heel, especially if they are sheltering Daenerys. Granting them independence in exchange for her head would only embolden them further. Robb gritted his teeth. Then we face a brutal campaign in mountainous terrain where every advantage is theirs. The corners of Tywin's mouth tightened. I've waged war in worse circumstances. The Targaryens' defeat at the Wendwater inflicted a severe blow. They are weakened. If we press hard, the Dornish lords might fear the might of our combined forces. Great John Umber rumbled. We're not built for desert fighting. Our men and horses will suffer. That is a risk, Tywin acknowledged curtly. But with discipline and rationing, we will persevere. We should choose one pass and commit. A divided approach allows the enemy to pick us off in detail. The group fell silent. Then Robb spoke slowly. The Bone Way might be narrower, but perhaps that's to our advantage. We could focus our scorpions in a tight corridor, forcing any dragons to come at us head-on, or else not at all. If the Targaryens attempt to burn us in that pass, they risk harming their own men. The same tight corridors that hamper us hamper them as well. Jaime stroked his chin. A valid point. But if the Dornish collapse the pass from higher ground, we'll be trapped. The Bone Way is riddled with precarious cliffs. Roose Bolton's flat voice interjected. I suggest we scout the pass first with a small, mobile force, at night perhaps. If the route is truly too well fortified, we pivot to the Prince's Pass. Tywin considered. Fine, I'll send outriders. A day to confirm, no more. We cannot linger. If the Targaryens see us dithering, they may strike preemptively. They concluded the council with that plan. Robb left with a taut sense of inevitability. Dorne was a hornet's nest, and they intended to march straight into it. If the dragons came in full strength, scorpions or no, the cost in blood could be tremendous. That night, the scouts set out. Robb did not join them. Tywin refused to risk his ally's king in a covert mission. Instead, Robb dozed fitfully in the battered watchtower, gray wind at his side, half dreaming of the day he had fought Jon near Summerhall, remembering the anguished look on Jon's face. Morning brought a scout's hurried return. The Bone Way was heavily watched by Dornish outriders, but the pass was not fully blocked, so far. There were only small pockets of soldiers harassing any approach. The Prince's Pass, on the other hand, was rumored to be patrolled by House Fowler's main strength, with archers stationed on vantage points. With that, Tywin gave the order. They would force the Bone Way, scorpions in the vanguard, shielded by heavy infantry, while cavalry guarded the rear. Robb supported this plan, though he dreaded the images in his head of men dying under scalding sunlight and dragonfire. They marched that day in 2 columns, converging at the mouth of the Bone Way by dusk. The land rose around them in broken ridges, high rocky slopes studded with thorny plants. The wind carried a new dryness, and the men sweltered in their armor, sweat streaking faces and soaking into gambesons. At the pass entrance, the vanguard halted at Tywin's command. Scouts reported Dornish outriders ahead. The next morning, the alliance advanced cautiously. Robb rode with the forward group, determined to see the lay of the land. He had Grey Wind lope alongside, the direwolf's tongue lolling in the heat. Though the sun had barely cleared the horizon, the day felt scorching to those accustomed to the north. The Bone Way was a winding defile, its floor littered with rocks that required the wagons carrying the scorpions to slow. Steep cliffs rose on either side. The men spread out as much as they could, archers scanning the high ridges. Here and there, small stands of scraggly bushes offered meager cover. Occasional glimpses of a distant aquamarine sky served only to highlight how penned in the pass felt. A whistle broke the silence. Then a volley of arrows rained down from above. Shouts of alarm rang out. Robb instinctively raised his shield, hearing the thunk of shafts biting into wood. A Lannister soldier cried out as an arrow took him through the neck. Others scrambled behind rocky outcroppings, but the pass offered little shelter from the heights. Northern archers, return fire, Robb bellowed. His men tried to shoot back at the hidden Dornish. But the archers on the cliff had the advantage of terrain and concealment. Meanwhile, Lannister crossbowmen fiddled with their cranks, loosing bolts upward. A handful of northern outriders took it upon themselves to scramble up goat paths in an attempt to flank the Dornish. The fighting was messy and sporadic, echoing in the narrow canyon. Tywin, riding not far behind the vanguard, cursed under his breath. "Keep the column moving," he shouted to his commanders. "Press on until we reach a wider area. Let the rearguard handle these gnats." Robb clenched his jaw and forced his horse forward, urging his men to keep pace. They slogged through the pass, mindful of every overhead ledge. Skirmishes erupted repeatedly. Dornish spearmen popped out from behind rocks to stab at the line, only to retreat when a large body of Lannister infantry advanced. The sun climbed higher, draining the men's energy. Water ran low by midday. By late afternoon, they found a space wide enough to position one scorpion effectively. Tywin ordered it unlimbered, scanning the cliffs for any sign of dragons. But for now, it seemed no dragons would appear. Daenerys, or whomever commanded her forces, likely waited deeper in Dorne. That night, the Alliance made camp in a cramped portion of the pass, ringed by sentries. Fires were kept small to avoid easy targets for archers. Men huddled in small groups, exchanging paranoid glances at the dark slopes looming over them. Robb tried to rest, but each time he closed his eyes, he heard the faint shuffle of rocks or the trickle of pebbles that might signal a Dornish raider. At some point past midnight, gray wind snapped upright, ears rigid, fangs bared. Robb bolted awake, sword half-drawn, heart hammering. But no attack came. Only the wind hissing through the ravine. Gradually, the dire wolf settled. Robb's chest felt tight as he lay back down on his bedroll, adrenaline still prickling in his veins. Pressing onward, the Alliance spent 4 excruciating days forcing their way along the Boneway. Each day brought new ambushes, while the supply lines stretched precariously behind them. Lannister outriders had to patrol constantly, fending off raids from small Dornish bands who knew every twist of the desert. The casualties, though not catastrophic, were wearing the men's morale thin. Finally, the pass opened onto a broader plateau, giving them a vantage to see the arid expanse that formed southern Dorne. From there, a stony road wound towards several small strongholds. Somewhere beyond the horizon rose the farmlands that ringed Sunspear and the coastal regions. Dust devils whirled along the horizon. Tywin conferred with Robb, Bolton, and the others at midday in the newly widened terrain. "We've lost too many men to constant harassment," Tywin said, voice taut. "But we're nearly through the pass. Once we descend onto open ground, we can form proper battle lines." Robb wiped sweat from his brow. "Assuming Daenerys chooses to meet us in open battle. If she's clever, she'll keep her dragons hidden and strike at our flanks with Dornish spears. She knows we have scorpions." A faint sneer curled Tywin's lip. "She cannot hide forever. If we threaten Sunspear, she must come forth or lose her seat of power. And if she does come forth, we'll use the scorpions to bring her dragons down." Despite his distrust, Robb found some logic in Tywin's words. The Targaryens had to protect their seat in Dorne or risk losing all. Indeed, if the Alliance seized Sunspear, House Martell would be broken. That might force Daenerys to parley or to risk a pitched battle. But Robb recalled the old histories, how the Dornish had resisted even the Targaryen conquest through guerrilla tactics. A part of him suspected that Daenerys would not rely solely on open-field engagements. She might use the advantage of flight to harass them over time, perhaps relying on the local lords to chip away at Tywin's army. They rested for an hour, letting the men catch their breath and drink from an underground stream that scouts found trickling nearby. The scorpions were checked and rechecked. Then, as the heat began to wane slightly, they marched out of the Boneway's shadow onto the plateau. A line of jagged hills rose to the south, beyond which they could glimpse patchy desert. The ground underfoot turned sandy in places. Their route curved eastward, following a stony track that presumably led deeper into Dornish territory. As the column advanced, dust clouds rose under thousands of boots. Late in the afternoon, the outriders reported sighting a distant force arrayed across a shallow valley. Banners of a golden spear piercing a red sun flapped in the wind, House Martell's sigil. A few black and red dragon banners as well. That sight quickened every heartbeat in the Alliance host. Tywin arranged the forces, Lannister knights on the right, northern cavalry on the left, with infantry forming the bulk in the center. The scorpions were spaced out behind the lines, loaded and manned. Robb could see the sweat beading on the scorpion engineers' brows, each man aware that dragons might soon fill the sky. The enemy force waited near enough now that Robb could see the gleam of spears in the lowering sun. Thousands of Dornishmen, lightly armored but swift, alongside some heavier contingents in scaled armor. And weaving among them large shapes in the air, dragons. Robb's mouth went dry at the sight. He counted 2. One soared high, circling, while the other perched upon a rock outcropping. The black scales with red membranes had to be Drogon if rumors spoke true. The other, greenish bronze, might be regal. The white and gold female Viserion he did not see, which unsettled him. Perhaps it was hidden behind the lines or in flight above the clouds. Sitting astride a white mare near the front of the Dornish lines was a woman with silver-gold hair, flanked by knights in black armor. Even from a distance, Robb recognized Daenerys Targaryen. She carried herself with queenly poise. No sign of Jon. A hush fell across the alliance ranks. Dust swirled underfoot, men shifting uncertainly. Robb felt the pulse in his ears. Would Daenerys speak or parley? Or would she simply unleash the dragons? Trumpets sounded from the Dornish lines, a clarion call. Then a lone rider with a white banner moved forward. Daenerys Targaryen had sent an envoy. Tywin nodded to a pair of Lannister men who rode out to meet the messenger halfway. The massed armies watched as the trio spoke in the valley's center. From afar, Robb tried to guess the exchange. Were they offering terms? Or demanding surrender? The conversation ended in fewer than 10 minutes. The rider returned to Daenerys's lines, while the Lannister men cantered back. Robb saw Tywin's face tighten as they delivered the message. What does she say? Robb demanded, guiding his horse closer. One of the Lannister men cleared his throat. She offers a single chance for us to depart Dorne and never return. She says she will spare us if we lay down our arms. Otherwise, she vows fire and blood. A mocking snort escaped Tywin. Fire and blood, how original. If she truly meant parley, she would have come herself. Robb's hands tensed on the reins. Did she say anything else? The Lannister messenger hesitated. She says the rightful king, Jon Targaryen, moves to secure the Vale and the Stormlands, and that soon we will be trapped between hammer and anvil. If we press forward into Dorne, we do so at our peril. Robb's heart lurched at the mention of Jon, but he set his jaw. She's trying to intimidate us. Tywin raised a hand, summoning a herald. Sound the attack. No further words are needed. Horns blared again. The alliance lines lurched into motion. Robb set his cavalry in a flanking maneuver, the Great Jon at the fore, while Lannister heavy horse took the opposite side. The center advanced at a measured pace behind tall shields, crossbows readied. The Scorpions rumbled forward, drawn by teams of horses, each crew scanning the sky. The Dornish answered with their own horns. Their ranks spread out, revealing lines of spearmen with round shields, a testament to the famed Dornish infantry. At their rear, Daenerys Targaryen remained atop her horse, a swirl of black banners around her. The dragons roared overhead, banked, and dove. A wave of arrows and quarrels darkened the sky on both sides. Men cried out, some falling. Robb roared for the cavalry to maintain formation, spurring his destrier into a canter. The ground vibrated under the thundering of hooves. Ahead, Dornish spears lowered, bracing for impact. In the dusty swirl, the dragons chose their moment. The black red beast, Drogon, let out an ear-splitting roar and descended in a rush of leathery wings. Gouts of flame spilled from its maw, igniting a swath of Lannister crossbowmen. Screams erupted. The stench of burning flesh filled the air. Scorpions! Fire! Someone bellowed. Crews scrambled to aim. One scorpion loosed a massive bolt that sailed wide. Another shot, the bolt grazing Drogon's scaled haunches. The dragon shrieked in rage and wheeled upward, trailing black smoke. Meanwhile, the cavalry charges clashed with savage force. Robb's men slammed into a line of Dornish spears. The Great Jon roared, swinging a two-handed axe that cleaved through shield and bone. Horses reared and screamed as spear points bit into their flanks. Dust flew, turning the battlefield into a vision of chaos. Robb drove his sword into a Dornish spearman, felt the hot spray of blood on his gauntlet. Gray wind launched at another man, dragging him down with snapping jaws. Droning war cries echoed. On the Lannister flank, Jaime led a wedge of knights that broke through the lighter Dornish lines, only to reel back when the second dragon, Regal, strafed them with flame. Again, the scorpions answered, one bolt narrowly missing the dragon's neck. Its roar shook the air. Despite the dragons, the alliance had sheer numbers and heavier armor. Gradually, the Dornish lines yielded ground. Over the clang of steel, Robb heard Daenerys' voice carrying across the chaos, urging her men to stand fast. Some knights in black armor tried to rally around her banner. Robb glimpsed her, a flash of silver hair amid the swirl, and thought, if we capture her, the war might end. He spurred his horse forward, cutting down a Dornish footman in his path. Grey Wind bounded alongside, savage with bloodlust. Robb crashed into a knot of black-clad knights, scattering them. A slash opened one knight's face, another toppled from the saddle. For a moment, he drew close enough to see Daenerys' eyes widen, her face a mask of determined fury. Then Drogon thundered down, smashing onto the ground between them. Robb's horse reared in terror, nearly unseating him. The dragon's wings beat at the air, stirring a choking cloud of dust. It bellowed flame that forced men and wolves to scramble back. Robb shielded his face, feeling the searing heat against his mail. Grey Wind yelped but darted aside, unharmed. Through the haze, Daenerys maneuvered away, protected by her monstrous child. Robb cursed, but he had no time to follow. The battle was in full pitch, men dying in droves. On the far side, the Lannister infantry pressed forward, forging a brutal wedge. Dornish lines buckled. Robb forced his horse around, ignoring the smoke stinging his eyes. "Rally on me," he shouted to the northern knights. They regrouped, adjusting for another push. Off to the side, scorpion bolts whistled overhead, still trying to pin down the dragons. A sudden gust of wind heralded Regal's approach. Flames drenched a swath of alliance men who had advanced too far from the scorpion's cover. Shrieks filled the air. Some Northmen broke ranks, trying to flee that living inferno. Robb's stomach churned, but he steeled himself and urged them to hold. "Stand fast. Keep formation or we're lost." A scorpion fired, and by some fortune or skill, the bolt struck Regal's flank, puncturing the thin membrane of a wing. The dragon shrieked, losing altitude. Another scorpion crew seized the chance, launching a second bolt that lodged in the creature's shoulder. Regal crashed to the ground in a tumble of wings and tail, thrashing wildly. The tremor of impact jolted men off their feet. Panic rippled among the Dornish to see one of Daenerys' dragons fall. With a savage roar, the Lannister infantry closed in on the downed beast. Their crossbows spat quarrels, though many bounced off the dragon's armored hide. The wounded dragon thrashed in agony, scorching the ground with jets of flame. Men who got too close were charred instantly, but the weight of numbers swarmed around it. Spears jabbed, trying to find gaps in its scales. Robb felt a wave of revulsion, but he pressed forward against the scattered Dornish lines. Another scorpion bolt soared, slamming into the dragon's flank. Regal's roars turned to a tortured keen. From across the field, a second roar answered, Drogon diving in a fury to save its sibling. Fire raked the ranks. Dozens of men died, including the scorpion crew who had just scored the hit. Yet it was too late for Regal. The dragon convulsed, battered by steel and crippled by scorpion bolts. With one final, shuddering exhalation, it collapsed, smoke curling from its maw. Its emerald eyes went dark. A hush, a moment of utter shock. The Alliance men who had cornered Regal let out ragged cheers, though many bore ghastly burns. Robb felt neither triumph nor pity, only grim horror. A dragon was dead, one of the greatest living weapons in the realm. But Drogon was still alive, and Daenerys' fury would know no bounds. In the swirl of dust and flame, Daenerys' forces wavered. Some began retreating, seeing their advantage undone. Others fought on desperately. Robb urged his men onward, determined to press the assault before Drogon could reassert control. Drogon, enraged, roared overhead. Gouts of fire hammered the lines. Another scorpion tried for a shot, but the crew was incinerated mid-aim. The battered Lannister cavalry reeled back from the blazing onslaught. Robb shielded his face as the heat licked at him, trying not to panic. Then the black beast swooped lower, unleashing a torrent of flame that set horse and man ablaze. It clawed at the ground, scattering infantry in all directions. Grey wind snarled and dashed aside, smoke rolling off scorched patches of earth. Within that chaos, Daenerys whipped her mare around, searching for a vantage. Robb saw her from the corner of his eye, the silver-haired queen, face streaked with dirt and tears, her expression contorted in rage. She pointed at the fallen regal, letting out a raw cry that was lost in the din. A cluster of Dornish knights surrounded her, forming a protective circle. One scorpion crew, well placed behind a slope of earth, tried a shot at Drogon as it circled to land near Daenerys. The bolt soared wide. Drogon slammed to the ground with thunderous force, momentarily bridging the distance to Daenerys. Soldiers scrambled away from the beast's lashing tail. It seemed the battle might turn again. If Daenerys mounted Drogon and took flight, she could lay waste to the entire field, scorpions or not. Robb signaled to the archers, desperate to keep her from taking off. A barrage of arrows hissed through the air, forcing the queen and her protectors to duck behind the dragon's flanks. Drogon roared, fury incarnate. In that heartbeat, Tywin Lannister's voice rose above the bedlam. "Forward! Seize her! Take her alive!" The Lannister line, battered but still numerous, surged. The Great Jon, shouting in savage joy, hacked aside 2 Dornish spearmen. Northern knights pressed forward, while riverlords advanced with spears. Robb spurred his horse forward, half-choked by the dust. If they could overwhelm Daenerys before Drogon took flight, the war might end. He thundered across the churned earth. Grey wind bounded ahead, moth-flecked with foam. But Drogon unleashed another inferno, forcing a ring of men to scatter. Screams rose anew. The dragon battered at the crowd with its wing, toppling knights. Daenerys tried to climb into the saddle rig that was lashed to Drogon's back, ignoring the storms of arrows. One arrow found its mark, cutting across her arm. She cried out, stumbling. A black-clad knight lunged to help her. The queen climbed up, wincing. Drogon hissed, wings stretching. If the dragon took flight now, they would lose this chance. Another scorpion bolt soared from the flank, close, but not close enough. Drogon twisted aside. The bolt crashed into the ground, spraying dirt. Then the beast launched upward, hauling Daenerys skyward, trailing a swirl of dust. Arrows flew after them, but the dragon kept climbing. A ragged wave of curses went up. Robb watched as Drogon banked, Daenerys clinging to its back. He braced for a final onslaught of flame. But the queen might have decided the risk was too great. Her forces were in disarray, and one dragon was dead. In a rush of wings, Drogon soared away, carrying Daenerys. The surviving Dornish began a disorderly retreat, pulling back from the battlefield. Some fled east, others scattered into the rocky terrain. The alliance pressed them, but the exhaustion and confusion dulled their momentum. Soon the dust-strewn field was littered with bodies, weapons, and wounded men screaming for mercy. The clangor faded as the last Dornish either fled or surrendered. Robb sat astride his horse, panting, scanning the horizon for any sign of a second approach by Drogon. The sky was empty except for drifting smoke. The sun, low on the horizon, glowed red as blood. A ragged cheer began among the Lannister soldiers who gathered near the carcass of Regal. They crowed triumph, praising the house that had slain a dragon. Tywin Lannister rode among them, expression grimly satisfied. Jaime followed, helmet dented, but still upright. Robb surveyed the dead. He saw both Northern and Dornish alike strewn in the sand. The stench was overpowering. His men held battered banners aloft, the direwolf limp with dust. The Great Jon shouted, "Victory!" but it sounded hollow. Robb could not help but think of the cost, and the knowledge that Daenerys and Drogon were still free. Roose Bolton rode up, face as impassive as ever. "A fierce engagement, sire. Many losses on both sides, but they are broken for now." "Any sign of the white and gold dragon?" Robb asked. Bolton shook his head. "None. Likely it still roams or is with Jon Targaryen elsewhere. I heard rumors that one dragon was left to guard Dorne's coastline. Perhaps that was Viserion. We cannot know." Robb exhaled. "We'll need to reorganize, treat the wounded, and decide how far we push. If Daenerys flees deeper into Dorne or tries to regroup with Jon, we might face another battle soon." Tywin approached in a swirl of dust, removing his helm to reveal sweat-plastered hair. He nodded curtly to Robb. We press on to Sunspear before they can muster fresh defenses. This was their field army or the bulk of it, but the city walls remain. We cannot afford to give Daenerys time to fortify behind her scorpions or to gather more men. A wave of exhaustion washed over Robb. We need at least a day to bury the dead, tend to the wounded, and gather supplies. A single day, then we march, Tywin said, wiping blood from his cheek. Rhaegal's death will demoralize the Dornish. They'll have no illusions about our intent now. Robb looked at the twisted dragon corpse half a field away. Smoke curled from the arrow wounds in its flank, greenish-black blood congealing in wide pools. The stench was nauseating. He realized that the Alliance had achieved the impossible, slain a dragon. Yet his heart felt heavy. The realm had not seen such carnage since Aegon's conquest centuries ago. Here they were, repeating bloody history under new banners, forging a future steeped in the same violence. Still, there was no turning back. The war demanded everything. They spent the night in the wreckage of the battlefield, setting up makeshift triage tents. Healers rushed among the dying, trying to stanch wounds, while men sobbed for water or mercy. Even the Great John, unstoppable as he seemed, had taken a nasty spear wound in his thigh. Robb visited him, offering words of encouragement as the healers worked. Outside, the Lannisters lit pyres for their dead, and so did the Northmen, though some insisted on burying or returning the bodies to the earth according to tradition. The mingled smoke of funeral fires drifted across the red sky, giving the scene a nightmarish cast. Robb slept scarcely at all. He kept hearing the dragon's dying screams in his head and seeing Daenerys's stricken face. He also remembered the news about Jon, that he was in the Vale or Stormlands forging alliances for a renewed offensive. The dread of facing Jon again weighed on him. Before dawn, Robb climbed a small rise overlooking the carnage. Gray wind patted at his heels, muzzle still stained from the previous day's violence. The horizon was a dull purple, the first glow of sunrise behind the ridges. In the stillness, Robb sank to his knees, pressing a hand into the dusty soil. He closed the endy-red beast Drogon, let out an ear-splitting roar and descended in a rush of leathery wings. Gouts of flame spilled from its maw, igniting a swath of Lannister crossbowmen. Screams erupted. The stench of burning flesh filled the air. Scorpions! Fire! Someone bellowed. Crews scrambled to aim. One scorpion loosed a massive bolt that sailed wide. Another shot, the bolt grazing Drogon's scaled haunches. The dragon shrieked in rage and wheeled upward, trailing black smoke. Meanwhile, the cavalry charges clashed with savage force. Robb's men slammed into a line of Dornish spears. The Great John roared, swinging a two-handed axe that cleaved through shield and bone. Horses reared and screamed as spear points bit into their flanks. Dust flew, turning the battlefield into a vision of chaos. Robb drove his sword into a Dornish spearman, felt the hot spray of blood on his gauntlet. Gray wind launched at another man, dragging him down with snapping jaws. Droning war cries echoed. On the Lannister flank, Jaime led a wedge of knights that broke through the lighter Dornish lines, only to reel back when the second dragon, Rhaegal, strafed them with flame. Again, the scorpions answered, one bolt narrowly missing the dragon's neck. Its roar shook the air. Despite the dragons, the Alliance had sheer numbers and heavier armor. Gradually, the Dornish lines yielded ground. Over the clang of steel, Robb heard Daenerys's voice carrying across the chaos, urging her men to stand fast. Some knights in black armor tried to rally around her banner. Robb glimpsed her, a flash of silver hair amid the swirl, and thought, if we capture her, the war might end. He spurred his horse forward, cutting down a Dornish footman in his path. Gray wind bounded alongside, savage with bloodlust. Robb crashed into a knot of black-clad knights, scattering them. A slash opened one knight's face, another toppled from the saddle. For a moment, he drew close enough to see Daenerys's eyes widen, her face a mask of determined fury. Then Drogon thundered down, smashing onto the ground between them. Robb's horse reared in terror, nearly unseating him. The dragon's wings beat at the air, stirring a choking cloud of dust. It bellowed flame that forced men and wolves to scramble back. Robb shielded his face, feeling the searing heat against his mail. Gray wind yelped but darted aside, unharmed. Through the haze, Daenerys maneuvered away, protected by her monstrous child. Robb cursed, but he had no time to follow. The battle was in full pitch, men dying in droves. On the far side, the Lannister infantry pressed forward, forging a brutal wedge. Dornish lines buckled. Robb forced his horse around, ignoring the smoke stinging his eyes. "Rally on me," he shouted to the northern knights. They regrouped, adjusting for another push. Off to the side, Endyred beast Drogon let out an ear-splitting roar and descended in a rush of leathery wings. Gouts of flame spilled from its maw, igniting a swath of Lannister crossbowmen. Screams erupted. The stench of burning flesh filled the air. "Scorpions! Fire!" someone bellowed. Crews scrambled to aim. One scorpion loosed a massive bolt that sailed wide. Another shot, the bolt grazing Drogon's scaled haunches. The dragon shrieked in rage and wheeled upward, trailing black smoke. Meanwhile, the cavalry charges clashed with savage force. Robb's men slammed into a line of Dornish spears. The Great John roared, swinging a two-handed axe that cleaved through shield and bone. Horses reared and screamed as spear points bit into their flanks. Dust flew, turning the battlefield into a vision of chaos. Robb drove his sword into a Dornish spearman, felt the hot spray of blood on his gauntlet. Gray wind launched at another man, dragging him down with snapping jaws. Droning war cries echoed. On the Lannister flank, Jaime led a wedge of knights that broke through the lighter Dornish lines, only to reel back when the second dragon, Regal, strafed them with flame. Again, the scorpions answered, one bolt narrowly missing the dragon's neck. Its roar shook the air. Despite the dragons, the alliance had sheer numbers and heavier armor. Gradually, the Dornish lines yielded ground. Over the clang of steel, Robb heard Daenerys' voice carrying across the chaos, urging her men to stand fast. Some knights in black armor tried to rally around her banner. Robb glimpsed her, a flash of silver hair amid the swirl, and thought, if we capture her, the war might end. He spurred his horse forward, cutting down a Dornish footman in his path. Gray wind bounded alongside, savage with bloodlust. Robb crashed into a knot of black-clad knights, scattering them. A slash opened one knight's face, another toppled from the saddle. For a moment, he drew close enough to see Daenerys' eyes widen, her face a mask of determined fury. Then Drogon thundered down, smashing onto the ground between them. Robb's horse reared in terror, nearly unseating him. The dragon's wings beat at the air, stirring a choking cloud of dust. It bellowed flame that forced men and wolves to scramble back. Robb shielded his face, feeling the searing heat against his mail. Gray wind yelped but darted aside, unharmed. Through the haze, Daenerys maneuvered away, protected by her monstrous child. Robb cursed, but he had no time to follow. The battle was in full pitch, men dying in droves. On the far side, the Lannister infantry pressed forward, forging a brutal wedge. Dornish lines buckled. Robb forced his horse around, ignoring the smoke stinging his eyes. "Rally on me," he shouted to the northern knights. They regrouped, adjusting for another push. Off to the side, scorpion bolts whistled overhead, still trying to pin down the dragons. A sudden gust of wind heralded Regal's approach. Flames drenched a swath of alliance men who had advanced too far from the scorpion's cover. Shrieks filled the air. Some Northmen broke ranks, trying to flee that living inferno. Robb's stomach churned, but he steeled himself and urged them to hold. "Stand fast. Keep formation or we're lost." A scorpion fired, and by some fortune or skill, the bolt struck Regal's flank, puncturing the thin membrane of a wing. The dragon shrieked, losing altitude. Another scorpion crew seized the chance, launching a second bolt that lodged in the creature's shoulder. Regal crashed to the ground in a tumble of wings and tail, thrashing wildly. The tremor of impact jolted men off. Tender hearts, Stark. You should know that by now. Jaime cleared his throat as if sensing the tension. Father, the Boy King in King's Landing, Tommen, might be vulnerable. If the rumors are true and Jon Targaryen moves with the Stormlands, we could lose the capital if we linger here too long. Tywin's glare flicked to Jaime, though he kept his tone measured. We have left a suitable garrison under Ser Kevan and Lord Tyrion. The city will not fall so easily. Robb's temper flared. We can't pretend we're not at risk. If Jon besieges King's Landing with another dragon at his command, the white and gold one, your garrison might not hold. All the while, we sit here in Dorne, whittling away our strength. Tywin looked at Robb long and hard. If Jon Targaryen rears his head at King's Landing, we will respond. But to retreat from Sunspear now, after coming so far, would be catastrophic for our cause. It would embolden Daenerys, give her time to rebuild, and prove to the realm that we fear the Targaryens. I have no intention of allowing that. A silence fell, dense with unspoken accusations. Robb wrestled with his frustration. He thought of Sansa, still captive in King's Landing, of Arya's uncertain fate, of the promises Tywin had made for the North's autonomy. If the alliance fractured now, his sisters would be in greater peril. The North would be left vulnerable if the Targaryens emerged victorious. Jaime exhaled, stepping forward. We could send an envoy, at least, to gauge Daenerys' willingness to parley. If she scoffs, we proceed. But perhaps, if we offer recognition of her claim in some limited sense, or propose a marriage alliance, Tywin's face darkened. Marriage alliance? Do you think that woman would wed a Lannister after what our family has done? Jaime lifted a brow. Stranger things have happened in the dance of alliances. Or perhaps she might wed someone else in the realm who could ease tensions. Robb's mind flicked to tales of the Targaryens, how they once wed brother to sister. But Jon was not physically here, and no arrangement with the Lannisters would satisfy the Dornish desire for vengeance. He felt a headache forming. Tywin waved a hand, dismissing the idea. Enough. We do not beg for parley. Let her come to us if she wants terms. Until then, we build our siege lines, we starve her. That is final. With that, the war council was effectively over. Robb left the pavilion, anger roiling in his gut. Outside, the night air was oppressively warm and the sky was studded with stars that gleamed like shards of broken glass. Gray wind nuzzled his leg, sensing his turmoil. Robb sank onto a bench near the glow of a single torch, letting out a weary sigh. He felt trapped in Tywin's plan. Each day they sat outside Sunspear was another day for Jon to move unopposed. He prayed that word of the North's safety would come soon, that the storms of war would not cross the neck to threaten his people. The Greyjoy's booming laugh suddenly echoed through the camp, followed by a cry of pain as the big man's wounded thigh presumably flared. Robb tried to find some measure of solace in such glimpses of normalcy, but it was fleeting. He stared out across the dark plain to where Sunspear's lights glittered. Somewhere within those walls, Daenerys Targaryen nursed her wrath, likely waiting for the moment to strike. And up there, in the star-littered sky, a single black shape might be gliding. Drogon. Robb breathed out a near-silent vow. We must end this, one way or another, before the realm is consumed. Days drifted into weeks of siege. The Alliance ringed Sunspear with earthworks, building trenches, and palisades to seal off the farmland that fed the city. The Green Blood River was patrolled by Lannister boats, though the Dornish occasionally launched nighttime raids from hidden inlets. Robb personally led a few skirmishes, testing the city's defenses only to find them stoutly manned. One gray dawn, alarms sounded through the siege camp. Robb jolted awake and raced outside, hand on his sword. A soldier ran past, shouting, "The dragon! The dragon is here!" He hurried to the palisade and saw it, Drogon in the sky, swooping low toward the Alliance lines. His black wings beat the air in fury. Atop him, Daenerys Targaryen, hair streaming behind her. A roar split the gloom. Men scrambled for the scorpions, dragging them into position. A rush of flame incinerated a section of the camp. Tents exploded in embers, men screaming. Another gout of fire hammered a wooden siege tower, turning it into a blazing pyre. The scorpion crews struggled to load and aim while the monstrous beast wheeled overhead. "Archers, loose!" Robb bellowed, though he knew normal arrows did little. 1,000 shafts lanced upward, but Drogon soared out of range. Then it dived again, spitting flame at the scorpions. One crew fired a bolt that missed by mere feet. The next shot from another scorpion struck Drogon's flank, but appeared to ricochet off thicker scales near its shoulder. The dragon shrieked, battered the scorpion with its tail, shattering the machine. Daenerys circled once more, scanning for weaknesses. Robb heard Tywin's furious commands from somewhere down the lines. Lannister crossbowmen regrouped, trying to protect the few operational scorpions left. Then, with savage speed, Drogon dove at a ring of supply wagons. Robb realized the Queen was targeting their food stores. Flame erupted. Grain sacks exploded in a burst of sparks. The heat was overwhelming, forcing men to fling themselves to the ground or into the nearby ditch. A scorpion's bolt ripped through the sky, barely missing the dragon's neck. Daenerys yanked the reins, Drogon twisting. The black beast bellowed, snapping its jaws, unleashing a torrent of flame that engulfed the scorpion. When the sun finally rose, the siege camp was partially ablaze, smoke billowing. Daenerys guided Drogon back toward the city walls, where she landed behind the safety of ramparts. The morning light revealed the alliance reeling from the damage. Supply wagons destroyed, scorpions shattered or charred, hundreds of men dead or wounded. Robb's face was streaked with soot. He oversaw the rescue of survivors from the flaming wreckage, feeling his chest tighten with despair. The Queen had struck a crippling blow, an audacious raid at dawn. Tywin arrived, flanked by Jaime, both covered in ash. Fury etched into Tywin's features. This can't go on. We'll starve out here before they do, with our supplies gutted. Robb spat dust. So do we assault the walls directly? We've lost many scorpions, so the dragon can strafe us in the open. Tywin's jaw flexed. Dorne must be brought under heel, but you're right, we cannot linger. If she can do this at will, we're finished. Jaime slanted a glance at Robb. Father, we might need to consider a partial withdrawal. Fall back, secure new supplies, rebuild the scorpions. Or else risk an all-out storming of the city. Tywin glowered. An assault on Sunspear's walls with that dragon overhead is suicide. Robb ran a hand through his sweat-damp hair. Then we have no good options. Either we starve them out and risk more raids, or we charge the walls and likely burn. If Jon is on the move elsewhere, we're trapped here. The nightmarish logic sank in, each alternative bleaker than the last. Tywin made a strangled noise of frustration. We must kill that last dragon. How? Robb demanded. We can't get close enough if it remains inside the city, and we no longer have enough scorpions to pin it down. Tywin said nothing for a moment, staring at the swirling smoke. Then his eyes gleamed with a cold, lethal idea. There may be a way, he said softly, though it is not straightforward. Poisons, infiltration, something that can kill a beast from within. We have men who know of such arts, Qyburn in King's Landing, for instance. Jaime frowned. You think we can slip a mummer's dragabane into their supplies? Daenerys is no fool. She'll guard Drogon like a child. Still, Tywin latched onto the notion. We will not break Sunspear by conventional siege if that dragon roams overhead. If infiltration and sabotage are the only ways, so be it. If we can kill Drogon, the city will fall easily. Robb's stomach churned. Smuggling poison into a city locked in war, that's an uncertain gamble at best. Tywin turned a frosty gaze on him. Do you have a better plan, Stark? Robb did not, and so Tywin's scheme began to take shape, reliant on cunning and shadow. A few Lannister agents, men with questionable skills in alchemy or poison, were tasked to find a route into Sunspear, perhaps bribing a guard, or posing as peasants, or some other ruse. If they could get near Drogon's food or water, slip in a potent toxin that would kill or weaken the dragon, the city might be undone. Robb looked on this with wary disbelief. Poison was a chancy weapon at best, especially for slaying a dragon. If discovered, it might make Daenerys more vengeful than ever. But the alternative, slow attrition and possible defeat, left Tywin unwavering. That night, Robb strolled the half-burned camp, listening to the moans of wounded men. The smell of charred flesh and horse flesh hung heavy. He passed rows of tents where healers worked by flickering lantern light. Among the injured, he spotted the Grachan's massive form, leg bandaged, cursing at the healers to let him drink more ale. Despite the man's bravado, Robb saw fear in his eyes, the memory of dragon fire. Pausing by one of the trenches, Robb found Bolton leaning against a post, his pallid face unreadable. A cunning plan, is it not? Bolton said quietly, as though reading Robb's thoughts. Try to poison a dragon or slip men into the city to kill it. We dance on a razor's edge. Robb crossed his arms, wanting to confide in someone, yet wary. A far cry from an honorable battle. But we've seen how honorable battles fare against a dragon. Bolton inclined his head in agreement. Indeed. Desperate times, desperate measures. If it succeeds, we might see an end to the siege. If it fails, Daenerys will burn our camp to the ground. Robb exhaled. At this point, I hardly see another path. And every day Jon gains more ground. If he takes King's Landing, my sisters, Bolton nodded, his voice low. We're bound to the Lannisters at least until we can secure your sister's safety and the North's future. This is the cost, my king. Or so it seems. Robb stared into the darkness, a cold feeling spreading in his chest. Once upon a time, he would have scoffed at the thought of assassinating a foe. Now, after all the blood spilled, he could not muster the old sense of moral high ground. War had shaped him into something new, and he loathed it yet saw no escape. Over the next week, Tywin's infiltration plan took shape. A small group of Lannister agents, supplemented by a few unscrupulous Sel's words, slipped away at night to try to find entry into Sunspear by sea. The Alliance camp maintained the appearance of a standard siege. Robb publicly continued building siege ramps and feigning readiness for a direct assault. The hope was that Daenerys and her guards would not suspect an infiltration. Meanwhile, reports trickled in that some Storm Lords had indeed risen for Jon Targaryen. A brief clash was rumored near Hayford, not far from King's Landing. Tyrion's letters to Tywin indicated that King's Landing remained tense but unbreached, with the Gold Cloaks and the City Watch on high alert. Tywin ordered more men to return north and bolster the capital's defenses, further thinning the siege lines here in Dorne. One evening, as Robb stood near a brazier finishing a supper of flatbread and dried figs, Jaime approached. The Kingslayer's face looked drawn from the stress of the endless campaign. "We received a raven from King's Landing," Jaime said quietly. "It seems Lord Tyrell and the Reach remain nominally loyal to Tommen, but their support is lukewarm at best. They do not dispatch many soldiers. They're hedging their bets, waiting to see if Jon Targaryen becomes the new power." Robb wiped his mouth. Typical. Everyone stands on a knife's edge. Jaime hesitated, then continued. "There's more. It seems Sansa Stark is to be, well, the Queen Regent demands she marry someone loyal to the Lannisters, as a means to ensure your continued cooperation. We do not know the details yet. Perhaps a minor lord or a ward of Tywin's." Robb's stomach twisted. Rage flared in him, and gray wind snarled under his breath. "Does Tywin know about this?" Jaime gave a small, grim nod. "He likely orchestrated it, or at least consents. They want to keep a tight leash on you, Robb. If you waver, they threaten your sister's well-being." Robb drew in a slow breath, forcing the anger to subside enough for thought. "He gave me his word that she would not be harmed, but forcing her to marry. That is how House Lannister operates," Jaime said wearily. "Marriage is a tool, a vow. If it helps them keep the North in line, they will do it. I tell you this because I suspect you might want to accelerate any attempt to free her." Robb stared into the brazier's coals. Sparks drifted upward in a hot swirl. "She's my sister. I won't let them use her like a pawn. But right now, if I break with Tywin, we lose everything. Our position, our chance to keep the North safe from Targaryens. And what then? Sansa might vanish into some dungeon, or meet a worse fate." Jaime inclined his head. "Indeed, you're caught in the web, Stark. But if we can kill Drogon and take Sunspear, perhaps the war will tilt heavily enough in our favor that Tywin can afford to release your sister. Or you can force his hand." Robb's laugh was bitter. "Yes, we just have to kill a dragon. Simple enough." Jaime gave a half-smile. "Well, you have done so once already, albeit with half your scorpions and an entire field army." Robb closed his eyes a moment, recalling the hellish battle in which Regal fell. That was no easy feat now. In a siege, Daenerys could strike at will while they had little recourse. Poison seemed the only real chance, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. He glanced at Jaime. "Why are you telling me all this? You're a Lannister. Is your loyalty wavering?" Jaime shrugged, looking off into the distance where torches dotted the siege perimeter. "My loyalty has always been complicated. I keep my family's interests at heart, but I know the cost of certain choices we've made. If I can reduce the harm to innocents, like your sister, for instance, perhaps that's worth something. Besides, I'm not blind to the possibility that Father's victory may lead to new horrors. A bit of forewarning might help you." Robb did not trust Jaime fully, but he sensed a thin thread of sincerity. "I appreciate the warning," he said gruffly. "It won't be forgotten." A faint, ironic smile curved Jaime's mouth. "How magnanimous of you, Your Grace." Then he turned and walked off into the gloom, leaving Robb to grapple with the precarious nature of his predicament. For another fortnight, the siege dragged on. Daenerys launched 2 more raids at night, setting portions of the camp ablaze with Drogon's fire. The second raid inflicted heavy losses on the Lannister cavalry. In response, the infiltration team sent by Tywin still had not returned or sent word. Morale sank further each day. At last, near the end of that fortnight, a single battered Sellsword stumbled back into the Alliance lines one sweltering afternoon. He was half dead from thirst and injuries. Tywin had him brought before a group of commanders. Tywin himself, Jaime, Robb, and a few others, in a dimly lit pavilion. The man's face was haggard, eyes rimmed in red. He slumped to his knees before them. We tried," he gasped. "We reached the city by boat at night, bribed a guard at the water gate, slipped into the stables. We had the poison, a potent substance from Qyburn's labs. The plan was to lace the dragon's feed or water." Tywin's voice was cold steel. "What happened?" The Sellsword coughed, spitting up blood. "We found the dragon's pen, near the old courtyard, but the queen's men discovered us. She has fanatics, some ex-slaves from Essos, men who worship her as Mysa. They sounded an alarm. The others died. I fled. We never reached the beast's food stores." Silence hung in the tent. Robb heard a faint rustle as Jaime shifted. Tywin's face was a mask of fury. The Sellsword swallowed hard. "The city's locked down now. We barely made it out a sewer. I was the only one. So close. Some men say they glimpsed the dragon's water trough. But it was guarded. We failed." Tywin's glare could have frozen steel. After a moment, he gestured for the man to be taken away to the healers. Then he turned to the assembled commanders. "So that plan is finished. And now Daenerys will be doubly cautious." Robb crossed his arms, swallowing a sense of doom. "We're back to the same predicament. She can raid us at will. We cannot starve the city easily. Supplies may reach her by sea or hidden routes. And Jon's armies creep ever closer to King's Landing." Tywin said nothing for a tense moment. Then he exhaled sharply, the lines around his mouth deepening. "We cannot remain here. Another few months of this and our forces will collapse from disease and desertion. And if Jon Targaryen takes the capital in our absence, it's all for nothing." Jaime ventured softly. "So we withdraw?" Tywin's tone was icy. "For now, yes. We will pull back, fortify the Boneway or Prince's Pass to keep the Dornish contained. Daenerys can rot in Sunspear if she wishes. Let her starve on her desert throne. We must return north to secure the capital and crush Jon Targaryen. Once that is done, we can deal with the Dragon Queen in time." Robb considered. A part of him felt an odd relief. The siege was hopeless, and perhaps this was for the best. Another part felt dread, because returning north meant a clash with Jon, and more battles that would pit him against his foster brother. He closed his eyes briefly, steeling himself. "Very well," he said, voice hoarse. "Let us break camp." Tywin nodded, already barking orders to messengers. "We depart within 3 days. Burn or dismantle anything we cannot carry. We head back through the Boneway. Ensure the Scorpions remain operational. Daenerys may harry our retreat." The retreat from Sunspear was as grueling as the approach had been. Men marched under the punishing sun, harassed by Dornish skirmishers and the ever-present threat of Drogon swooping down. Indeed, Daenerys struck the rear guard twice, wreaking havoc on supply wagons. Each time, the Scorpions tried to retaliate, but the dragons soared out of range before they could draw a bead on it. Days and nights blended into a haze of forced marches, minimal rest, and stifling heat. The Alliance finally reached the narrower portion of the Boneway, where they set up a defensive position to block any large Dornish pursuit. There, Tywin installed a garrison of a few thousand men, with fortifications to hold the pass. Then the bulk of the army pressed on northward, returning to the cooler fields of the Stormlands with battered pride. As they approached the Stormlands border, a scout galloped in, breathless, to deliver urgent tidings. Jon Targaryen had been seen near King's Landing, forging alliances with disaffected lords. He had not yet besieged the city, but rumor claimed he was mustering a substantial host. Daenerys might join him if she managed to cross the sea or slip through the passes behind them. The realm teetered on a knife's edge. That evening, Tywin summoned Robb to his command tent, a threat of alarm in his voice. Robb entered and found Tywin hunched over maps, Jaime standing behind him, arms folded. A guttering lantern cast flickering light on Tywin's harsh features. "There's news from the capital," Tywin said, lifting his eyes to Robb. "Word has it that your sister, Sansa, has been wed in a hastily arranged ceremony." He paused, thin-lipped, to Ser Lancel Lannister, my nephew. Robb's blood pounded. Lancel? The one who served as king's guard to Joffrey. Yes, Tywin said. A devout man of the faith these days, though he remains loyal to our house. My sister authorized it, presumably to ensure your continued cooperation. That vow now binds Sansa to House Lannister. Robb's teeth clenched so hard his jaw ached. You promised her safety, not a forced marriage. Tywin's expression was implacable. She lives, and as Lady of House Lannister, she is afforded a certain rank. You have my condolences if the arrangement displeases you. But that is done now. My sister took advantage of our absence. Robb's fists shook. He loathed the helplessness that churned in his gut. I will see her freed from this travesty, or Tywin cut him off. Come yourself, Stark. If you wish to free your sister, you must ensure our victory. Once the Targaryens are crushed, I will see to it that her marriage is dissolved, if that is your wish. But not before. Tremors of rage moved through Robb. You hold my sister as a bargaining chip. Jaime sighed. It appears so, yes. My father is not behind every plot in King's Landing, even if he tries. Cersei has her own designs. Tywin's jaw tightened. Regardless of who arranged it, the result is the same. You and I must remain allied. We must destroy Jon Targaryen and Daenerys. Once that is accomplished, we can reorder the realm as we see fit. Robb's voice was icy. Very well, Lord Tywin. Let us crush Jon Targaryen if that is what it takes. Inside, his heart twisted in anguish. The boy he had grown up beside, the brother he had once loved, was now the final obstacle to saving Sansa and possibly the North. There could be no illusions left. In forging this alliance with the Lannisters, Robb had sold his soul to a devil. If Jon threatened that arrangement, Robb would have to meet him on the battlefield once more. They pressed onward, traveling quickly through the Stormlands, ignoring the battered hamlets and scorched fields left by earlier conflicts. Columns of Lannister cavalry fanned out to discourage any local lords from attacking. The northern foot soldiers marched in sullen silence, wearied by the long campaign. Some nursed old resentments about fighting beside the Lannisters, but fear of dragonfire compelled them to cling together. At last, the walls of King's Landing rose in the distance, half-shrouded by the rising sun. Seeing them again made Robb's chest tighten. It was here that his father had been executed, here that Sansa remained a captive in a forced marriage. The city's silhouette looked almost serene in the early light. They found the capital in a state of tense readiness. The gold cloaks lined the battlements, and more scorpions had been installed along the walls, courtesy of Qyburn's contrivances. Tyrion Lannister greeted them at the gates, his mismatched eyes full of curiosity and relief. As Robb and Tywin dismounted in the courtyard of the Red Keep, Tyrion approached with a quick bow to Tywin, then nodded to Robb. "Welcome back," the dwarf said, voice dry. "How fares Dorne?" Tywin's expression soured. "A stalemate, thanks to Daenerys and her damned dragon. We have left a garrison to contain them while we handle more pressing threats." "Where's Jon Targaryen now?" Tyrion's mouth twisted in a half-grimace. He was last seen near Rosby, rallying some of the local lords. It seems the Stormlands are split, some remain loyal to Tommen, others to Jon. There was a minor clash near Duskendale, but nothing decisive. Jon is rumored to have the white and gold dragon, Viserion, though it has not been spotted often. Perhaps he's keeping it in reserve. Robb stepped forward. "Has Jon made any attempt to parley?" Tyrion shook his head. "No official envoys arrived, but there are rumors that some noble houses, including a few from the Reach, might join him if he shows decisive strength. He might be waiting, father, for our war in Dorne to drain us further." Tywin let out a long breath. "That ends now. We will muster all available forces in the Crownlands and crush him before he can gather more allies. Let us see how well Jon Targaryen fares without an army of Dornish spearmen or the Unsullied." Robb felt a hollowness open inside him. So it would come to this. Another cataclysmic battle. Another wave of bloodshed. This time, no illusions remained. If Jon refused to bend the knee, Robb must fight him, for the sake of Sansa and the North's precarious future. He followed Tywin and Tyrion into the Red Keep's dark halls, gray wind padding warily at his side. The sense of foreboding pressed in around him. The last time he had walked these corridors was as a prisoner briefly, before his father's execution. Now he came as a reluctant ally of the Lannisters. He thought of Sansa, so near yet unreachable. She would be in some tower or chamber, forced into a union with Lancel Lannister. The thought made his hands shake with fury, but he forced it down, reminding himself that open defiance would only give Tywin an excuse to imprison her further. Within hours of their arrival, Tywin began mobilizing the city's garrison and preparing for a campaign against Jon Targaryen. Ravens flew out to lords loyal to Tommen, summoning them to gather near the Blackwater for a decisive confrontation. The mood in the city was grim but resigned. War had become the new normal. Robb spent the night in a small suite of rooms in Maegor's Holdfast, guarded by Lannister men. He paced restlessly, gray wind at his heels. The knowledge that Sansa was somewhere nearby gnawed at him. He had to see her, reassure her, perhaps plan an escape. But doing so openly would invite Tywin's wrath. Still, as midnight approached, Robb decided the risk was worth it. He left gray wind in his room, slipping into the corridors in a dark cloak. He had walked these halls enough to know some secret ways, gleaned from old stories or second-hand accounts from men who had once served in the Red Keep. The castle was shadowy at this hour, torches guttering in sconces. Patrols of gold cloaks moved in pairs. Robb took care to avoid them, ducking into alcoves. He made his way toward the tower rumored to house Sansa. Quiet as a cat, he crept along a narrow staircase and peered around a corner. A single guard in Lannister livery stood by a thick wooden door. Robb's heart pounded. Drawing a dagger, he eased closer. The guard, half drowsy, only noticed movement at the last moment. He reached for his sword, but Robb pressed the dagger to his throat in a swift motion, whispering, "Make no sound, and I let you live." The guard froze, eyes bulging. Robb gestured with his free hand at the door. "Where is Lady Sansa?" The man swallowed. "Inside with her ladies. She's under orders not to leave." Robb nodded. "You will move aside. If you raise an alarm, you die." The guard carefully stepped away from the door, leaving it unbarred. Robb pressed a finger to his lips, then pressed the dagger's pommel against the guard's head with enough force to knock him senseless. The guard collapsed without a cry. Robb eased the door open and slipped inside. The chamber was dimly lit by a single lantern. Soft bedding, richly embroidered drapes. A gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. A slight gasp came from the corner. Sansa stood, clad in a pale nightdress, eyes wide. Two terrified maidservants crouched behind her, uncertain. "Robb!" Sansa breathed, as if she could not believe her own eyes. In a stride, he crossed the room and gathered her in an embrace. She let out a trembling sob, burying her face in his chest. He stroked her hair gently. In that moment, all the war and heartbreak fell away, replaced by the simple relief of seeing his sister alive. "Sansa, I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I've failed you. She shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I never thought to see you again. They told me you were allied with the Lannisters, that you—" She broke off, swallowing hard. He gripped her shoulders. "I did what I had to keep the North safe and to gain a chance of freeing you. How are you? Have they harmed you?" She looked aside, the flicker of pain in her eyes. "No, not physically. But this marriage to Lancel, it's humiliating. He's not cruel, but I'm his wife by force, with no love between us. Cersei ensures I'm guarded at all hours. I can't leave these rooms without an escort." Robb's jaw clenched. He suppressed the impulse to storm off and slaughter every Lannister guard in the castle. That would only get them both killed or captured. Instead, he brushed a tear from Sansa's cheek. "I swear, once the Targaryens are defeated, I'll force them to annul this farce. I'll bring you home to Winterfell." She gave a shaky nod, voice hushed. "Winterfell, I dream of it so often, though it's cold and empty in my dreams. I fear we've lost everything, Robb." Father, mother, Bran, Rickon, and Arya, we don't even know if she's alive. He closed his eyes, the ache in his chest near unbearable. We'll find them or avenge them. Promise. For now, I needed to see you, to know you were alive. She clung to him briefly. Then, gathering her composure, she pulled back and managed a tremulous smile. You look so different, harder, but you're still my brother. Thank the gods. He forced a small, sad smile. Yes, for all that's happened, I'm still me. Her voice dipped to a whisper. Can you free me? Could we escape the castle tonight? Robb's heart twisted. They'd hunt us down, Sansa. You are too valuable a hostage. If we tried, they might kill us both or hurt you in retaliation. I must handle it carefully. When the time is right, I'll come for you. A new tear spilled from her eye, but she nodded, as if she had expected that answer. At least I have hope now. I can endure. He pressed his forehead to hers gently. Be strong. If you can, gather any information about Cersei's plans. But don't risk yourself. I'll do all I can to bring an end to this war. She squeezed his hand. I will. Just please keep yourself safe, Robb. I've lost so many of our family already. He embraced her one last time. Then, with a heavy heart, he turned to leave. The maidservants remained silent, eyes big as saucers. Sansa's lips trembled in a farewell. Robb slipped out, gently closing the door. The guard he had knocked out was still there, unconscious. Robb left him breathing, making his way back into the corridors with soft steps, heart pounding with conflicting emotions. A few days later, the Alliance mustered outside King's Landing, forming a grand host. Lannister forces swelled with fresh recruits from the Westerlands, while Robb's northern men, though weary, lined up in disciplined ranks. Alongside them came some Crownland lords, nominally loyal to Tommen. Tywin meant to scour the region for Jon Targaryen's host, force him into open battle, and deliver a crushing blow. Robb rode near the front, Grey Wind loping beside him. Tyrion and Tywin led columns of Lannister pikemen and knights, while Jaime took a vanguard of cavalry. The roads north of King's Landing were trampled underfoot by thousands of soldiers in mail and boiled leather, their banners fluttering in the wind. Messengers darted in and out with news. Jon had been spotted near Maidenpool, then near Rosby, now rumored near Bywater. The contradictory reports suggested that Jon's forces were on the move, not yet concentrated for a decisive stand. The Alliance advanced in cautious pursuit, hoping to corner Jon. Yet as they passed the crossroads leading to Duskendale, they found a grisly sight. A burned Lannister outpost, corpses strewn about. The cause became obvious from the scorched ground. Dragonfire. So Viserion was in the field after all. Tywin's expression hardened, and he accelerated the pace. By forced marches, they scoured the roads, searching for signs of Jon's main host. Scouts claimed to see banners of the Stormlands, some Vale contingents under banners of House Royce, even a few from the Reach. While not a massive army, it was formidable, bolstered by the presence of a living dragon. Finally, near the rolling hills north of Rosby, they found Jon's army arrayed across a broad field. The sun was high, glinting off thousands of spears and swords. Banners of black and red, the Targaryen sigil, waved in the breeze, but interwoven with them were personal sigils from the Stormlands, the Vale, and even some houses once sworn to the crown. In their midst soared a white and gold shape, circling overhead, Viserion. Robb's throat went dry at the sight. Trumpets sounded on both sides. The Alliance deployed into battle lines, scorpions spaced out behind the Lannister ranks. Northern cavalry took the left flank, Lannister knights the right, with crossbowmen in the center. Jon's forces mirrored them, archers and pikemen forming a resolute line. Robb gazed through the churned dust, searching for Jon. At last, he spotted a figure in black armor trimmed with red, a half-wolf, half-dragon sigil on the breastplate. Jon Targaryen, Jon Snow, the brother he had grown up with, sat astride a smoky gray stallion near the front ranks, surrounded by Stormland knights. His dark hair rippled in the wind, face grim. Memories flickered through Robb's mind. laughing with Jon in Winterfell's courtyard, racing along the walls, sparring with wooden swords, teasing Arya and Sansa. Now they stood on opposite sides of an apocalyptic field, each leading thousands of men to kill each other. The weight of it nearly crushed Robb's resolve. But Sansa's face rose in his mind, along with the countless northern men who had followed him. He had no choice. A horn blared. Drums rumbled across the field. Tywin raised his sword, the Lannister standard behind him snapping in a stiff breeze. Then the alliance advanced. The Targaryen side answered, horns echoing, the line surging forward. At once, the Scorpions opened fire, launching heavy bolts skyward, trying to strike Viserion. The white and gold dragon let out a piercing roar, veering to avoid the deadly projectiles. One bolt ripped through its wing membrane, but it remained airborne. A volley of arrows followed, clattering harmlessly against its scales. The armies collided in a thunderous crash of steel. On the left, Northern cavalry hammered into Stormland pikemen. On the right, Lannister knights clashed with Vale riders. In the center, crossbow bolts tore through ranks of Jon's foot soldiers, who answered with a hail of arrows. Smoke and dust thickened. Men screamed, horses shrieked. Robb led a wedge of Northern horse into a flank assault on the Vale archers, cutting them down in a flurry of hooves and swords. Blood spattered his armor. He felt Grey Wind's presence, heard the direwolf snarls amid the chaos. Above them, Viserion dived. Flames licked across the field, incinerating a cluster of Lannister crossbowmen. The stench of scorched flesh and hair choked the air. Another Scorpion pivoted, loosing a bolt that missed by inches. Viserion soared away, trailing a shrieking cry. Somewhere beyond the melee, Robb knew Jon was in the thick of it, rallying his men. The urge to find Jon, to speak with him, waged war against the demands of command. If he sought Jon alone, was there any chance of parley? Or would the tides of battle sweep them into a lethal clash again? He heard a ragged cheer from Lannister lines. One Scorpion bolt had struck Viserion's hind leg. The dragon roared but continued flying. Another bolt soared wide. Viserion retaliated with a gout of flame that consumed the Scorpion crew. The struggle for the skies would continue. Blood pounded in Robb's ears. He led a charge against a disorganized group of Stormland footmen, scattering them. Then, across the field, he saw a swirl of black armor. Jon. Surrounded by knights, he was hacking his way through Lannister infantry. A litter of bodies lay in his wake. "Form on me," Robb shouted to a handful of Northern cavalry. They spurred their horses forward, cutting through the chaos. Grey Wind dashed ahead. In moments, Robb was close enough to see Jon's face, spattered with blood, eyes burning with determination. Their gazes locked. "Robb!" Jon cried, voice ragged. Then he turned, parrying a Lannister knight's blow, driving his sword into the man's side. The knight crumpled. Robb felt an instinctive surge of protectiveness for his men, even the Lannisters now, but he pressed onward. "Jon!" Robb shouted back. "Yield! We needn't do this." Jon's mouth twisted in anger, or perhaps despair. "After all you've done? Allying with the men who killed our father, forcing Sansa into a marriage? Betraying everything we stood for at Winterfell?" Robb reined in, sword raised. They circled each other, war raging around them. "I did what I had to. For the North. You've damned the North." Jon snarled, tears of rage in his eyes. "If you stand with the Lannisters, you're no brother of mine." Steel rang as they closed, swords clashing in a flurry. Horses danced. Men around them gave them space as the swirling melee parted. Once more, Robb found himself trading blow for blow with the only brother he had ever truly known. They were more evenly matched now than at Summerhall. Jon moved with lethal grace, each strike purposeful. Robb met him, blocking and riposting, the ring of steel echoing above the din. The memory of their boyhood sparring flickered through Robb's mind, overshadowed by the reality of death at every stroke. Grey Wind snarled, prepared to leap, but Robb barked, no. He could not sick the dire wolf on Jon. This was between them. Grey Wind prowled in agitation, uncertain. Jon seized an opening, slashing across Robb's upper arm. The mail deflected much of it, but pain shot through him. He hissed, pressing the attack. Their blades locked, faces inches apart. "You can still end this," Jon panted. "Turn on the Lannisters. Help me free the realm from their tyranny. I'll spare your men." Robb's eyes burned with heartbreak. "They hold Sansa. They will never let her go if I betray them. And the North is all I have left. My father's memory, they executed him." Jon spat. "You'll never restore his memory by fighting for his murderers." Robb's chest heaved. "What choice do I have?" Jon's expression flickered with pity or sorrow. Then he shoved Robb back with a burst of strength, whirling to defend against a Lannister soldier who lunged. The soldier's sword bit into Jon's side, but Jon pivoted and killed him in a single blow. Another swirl of men crashed in, separating Jon and Robb in the chaos. A thunderous roar overhead signaled Viserion's next dive. Robb glimpsed the dragon's white scales shining in the sun, flame erupting onto the battlefield. The scorpions answered, launching a volley. One bolt tore into the dragon's wing, another slammed into its flank. Viserion roared in agony, losing altitude. The watchers gasped as the dragon, wounded, veered drunkenly over the field, crashing into a shallow hillside. It thrashed, flames licking from its jaws, scything down anything within reach. Robb saw the Targaryen lines waver at the sight of their dragon in peril. Jon let out a tortured shout, trying to reach Viserion. But a wave of Lannister infantry swarmed him, driving him back. Robb's men pressed the advantage, hammering the disorganized Targaryen troops. Tywin, seeing the dragon's light, bellowed for the scorpions to converge. Crews rushed, reloading the massive bolts. They unleashed another barrage at the struggling beast. Viserion screamed, pinned down by multiple bolts. A wash of blue and gold flame incinerated a scorpion crew. The air reeked of burnt flesh. Jon, in a frenzy, hacked through Lannister soldiers and tried to charge. Grey Wind snarled, bounding into his path, but Robb shouted again, "No, Grey Wind." The direwolf hesitated, letting Jon slip past. But half a dozen Lannister knights tackled Jon from his flank, bearing him to the ground. He lashed out, wounding two, but was soon overwhelmed by sheer numbers. More men joined, pummeling him with shield blows. In seconds, Jon lay pinned under a mass of armed soldiers. Robb found himself shouting, "Don't kill him." Furious as he was with Jon, he would not see him butchered. If they captured Jon, they might force a peace and perhaps free Sansa. Several scorpion bolts sank into Viserion's torso, piercing the dragon's heart. The beast gave a final, keening roar that shook the battlefield, then collapsed, eyes glazing. A hush fell, broken only by sporadic combat as the Targaryen lines realized their dragon was gone. Panic rippled. Many threw down arms and fled. Others surrendered in place. The Alliance let out a ragged cheer, though it sounded more like a groan of exhaustion and relief. Robb dismounted, approaching the knot of men holding Jon. They pried off Jon's helm, revealing his bruised face, eyes ablaze with fury. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead. He struggled, but the knights pinned him tight. "You traitor," Jon rasped to Robb, voice thick with pain. "You, let them kill." His breath faltered. Robb's heart pounded. "Take him alive," he ordered the knights. "Bind his wounds. He's worth more to us breathing." One Lannister knight spat. "He's Rhaegar's bastard spawn. Let's finish him." Robb pressed the tip of his sword to the knight's breastplate. "He's my prisoner. Do you question your allies, knight?" The man glowered but relented. Jon, half delirious, gazed at Robb with a twisted mix of hatred and heartbreak. "You'll regret this, or the realm will," he managed. Then he sagged into unconsciousness. Around them, the final pockets of Targaryen resistance collapsed. The battered alliance, Stark, Lannister, and Crownland men held the field. Tywin approached, taking in the scene, the corpse of Viserion still steaming, Jon Targaryen captive on the ground. He nodded, a grim satisfaction in his eyes. "Two dragons dead, one left in Dorne," Tywin said quietly. "And Rhaegar's heir in our hands. The war is nearly won." Robb looked at Jon's prone form, blood pooling beneath him on the churned earth. Memory after memory flooded back, the boy with the solemn gray eyes, training at arms, the laughter echoing across the courtyard, the brother he had once cherished. Now in the dust and ruin, that boy lay beaten and broken. Robb's sword felt unbearably heavy in his hand. Grey Wind whined softly at his side. Around him, men cheered, exulting in a victory that felt more like a curse. Tywin's words drummed in Robb's ears, "The war is nearly won." But for Robb Stark, king in the north turned ally of the Lannisters, there was no taste of triumph. Only a cold emptiness and the knowledge that when you sow war in the name of duty, you harvest heartbreak with every blade of grass trodden by armies. He closed his eyes for a moment, gripping the hilt of his sword until his knuckles whitened. Then he looked up, swallowing his grief. One final act remained, forcing Daenerys Targaryen alone with her last dragon in Dorne to bend the knee or perish. But for now, the horizon belonged to the Lannisters and their new kingly ally from the north. No matter how stained his hands, Robb would see this through, for Sansa's sake, for the North's. And he told himself that was enough to justify every sin. Yet deep in his heart, the ghosts of Winterfell whispered that some debts of blood could never be repaid. He wondered if, when all was done, anything honorable would remain of the son Ned Stark had raised. His men raised a battered dire wolf banner in the midst of the carnage. Lions stood guard on either side, and at Robb's feet lay Jon Targaryen, unconscious, with tears of frustration and betrayal drying on his cheeks. Thus ended their second battle as foes, brothers severed by war, each paying a price far greater than crowns could ever redeem.